Chapter 4, Part 3 of The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 4, Part 3. The Open Boat Navigation. On another occasion, when a stew of oysters was distributed among the people, Lieutenant Bligh observes, in the manuscript journal, "In the distribution of it, the voraciousness of some and the moderation of others were very discernible. The master began to be dissatisfied the first, because it was not made into a larger quantity by the addition of water, and showed a turbulent disposition, until I laid my commands on him to be silent. Again, on his refusing bread to the men, because they were collecting oysters, he says, this occasioned some murmuring with the master and carpenter, the former of whom endeavoured to prove the propriety of such an expenditure, and was troublesomely ignorant, tending to create disorder among those, if any were weak enough to listen to him." If what Bligh states with regard to the conduct of the master and the carpenter be true, it was such, on several occasions, as to provoke a man much less irritable than himself. He thus speaks of the latter when in the ship and in the midst of the mutiny. The boatswain and carpenter were fully at liberty. The former was employed, on pain of death, to hoist the boats out, but the latter I saw acting the part of an idler, with an impudent and ill-looking countenance, which led me to believe he was one of the mutineers, until he was among the rest ordered to leave the ship, for it appeared to me to be a doubt with Christian at first, whether he should keep the carpenter or his mate, Norman, but knowing the former to be a troublesome fellow, he determined on the latter. The following paragraph also appears in his original journal, on the day of the mutiny, but is not alluded to in his printed narrative. The master's cabin was opposite to mine. He saw them, the mutineers, in my cabin, for our eyes met each other through his door window. He had a pair of ship's pistols loaded, and ammunition in his cabin. A firm resolution might have made a good use of them. After he had sent twice or thrice to Christian to be allowed to come on deck, he was at last permitted, and his question then was, "Will you let me remain in the ship?" "No." "Have you any objection, Captain Bligh?" I whispered to him to knock him down. Martin is good. This is the man who gave the shaddock, for this was just before Martin was removed from me. Christian, however, pulled me back and sent away the master, with orders to go again to his cabin, and I saw no more of him until he was put into the boat. He afterwards told me that he could find nobody to act with him, that by staying in the ship he hoped to have retaken her, and that, as to the pistols, he was so flurried and surprised that he did not recollect he had them. This master tells a very different story respecting the pistols in his evidence before the court-martial. Whatever, therefore, on the whole, may have been the conduct of Bligh towards his officers, that of some of the latter appears to have been on several occasions provoking enough, and well calculated to stir up the irascible temper of a man, active and zealous in the extreme, as Bligh always was, in the execution of his duty. Some excuse may be found for hasty expressions uttered in a moment of irritation, when passion gets the better of reason, but no excuse can be found for one, who deeply and unfeelingly, without provocation, and in cold blood, inflicts a wound on the heart of a widowed mother, already torn with anguish and tortured with suspense for a beloved son, whose life was in imminent jeopardy. Such a man was William Bligh. This charge is not loosely asserted. It is founded on documentary evidence under his own hand. Since the death of the late Captain Hayward, some papers have been brought to light that throw a still more unfavourable stigma on the character of the two commanders, Bligh and Edwards, than any censure that has hitherto appeared in print, though the conduct of neither of them has been spared whenever an occasion has presented itself for bringing their names before the public. Bligh, it may be recollected, mentions young Hayward only as one of those left in the ship. He does not charge him with taking any active part in the mutiny. There is every reason indeed to believe that Bligh did not, and indeed could not, see him on deck on that occasion. In point of fact, he never was within 30 feet of Captain Bligh, and the booms were between them. About the end of March 1790, 2 months subsequent to the death of a most beloved and lamented husband, Mrs. Hayward received the afflicting information, but by report only, of a mutiny having taken place on board the Bounty. In that ship Mrs. Hayward's son had been serving as a midshipman, who, when he left his home in August 1787, was under 15 years of age, a boy deservedly admired and beloved by all who knew him, and, to his own family, almost an object of adoration, for his superior understanding, and the amiable qualities of his disposition. In a state of mind little short of distraction, on hearing this fatal intelligence, which was at the same time aggravated by every circumstance of guilt that calumny or malice could invent with respect to this unfortunate youth, who was said to be one of the ringleaders, and to have gone armed into the captain's cabin, his mother addressed a letter to Captain Bligh, dictated by a mother's tenderness, and strongly expressive of the misery she must necessarily feel on such an occasion. The following is Bligh's reply. London, April 2nd, 1790. Madam, I received your letter this day, and feel for you very much, being perfectly sensible of the extreme distress you must suffer from the conduct of your son Peter. His baseness is beyond all description, but I hope you will endeavour to prevent the loss of him, heavy as the misfortune is, from afflicting you too severely. I imagine he is, with the rest of the mutineers, returned to Otaheite. I am, Madam, (Signed) William Bligh. Colonel Holwell, the uncle of young Hayward, had previously addressed Bligh on the same melancholy subject, to whom he returned the following answer. 26th of March, 1790. Sir, I have just this instant received your letter. With much concern I inform you that your nephew, Peter Hayward, is among the mutineers. His ingratitude to me is of the blackest dye, for I was a father to him in every respect, and he never once had an angry word from me through the whole course of the voyage, as his conduct always gave me much pleasure and satisfaction. I very much regret that so much baseness formed the character of a young man I had real regard for, and it will give me much pleasure to hear that his friends can bear the loss of him without much concern. I am, sir, etc., (Signed) William Bligh. The only way of accounting for this ferocity of sentiment towards a youth, who had in point of fact no concern in the mutiny, is by a reference to certain points of evidence given by Hayward, Hallett, and Purcell on the court-martial, each point wholly unsupported. Those in the boat would no doubt, during their long passage, often discuss the conduct of their messmates left in the Bounty, and the unsupported evidence given by these three was well calculated to create in Bligh's mind a prejudice against young Hayward. Yet, if so, it affords but a poor excuse for harrowing up the feelings of near and dear relatives. As a contrast to these ungracious letters, it is a great relief to peruse the correspondence that took place on this melancholy occasion between this unfortunate young officer and his amiable but dreadfully afflicted family. The letters of his sister Nessy Hayward, of which a few will be inserted in the course of this narrative, exhibit so lively and ardent an affection for her beloved brother, are couched in so high a tone of feeling for his honour and confidence in his innocence, and are so nobly answered by the suffering youth, that no apology seems to be required for their introduction, more especially as their contents are strictly connected with the story of the ill-fated crew of the Bounty. After a state of long suspense, this amiable and accomplished young lady thus addresses her brother. Isle of Man, 2nd of June, 1792. In a situation of mind only rendered supportable by the long and painful state of misery and suspense we have suffered on his account, how shall I address my dear, my fondly beloved brother? How describe the anguish we have felt at the idea of this long and painful separation, rendered still more distressing by the terrible circumstances attending it? Oh, my ever dearest boy, when I look back to that dreadful moment which brought us the fatal intelligence that you had remained in the Bounty after Mr. Bligh had quitted her, and were looked upon by him as a mutineer, when I contrast that day of horror with my present hopes of again beholding you, such as my most sanguine wishes could expect, I know not which is the most predominant sensation, pity, compassion, and terror for your sufferings, or joy and satisfaction at the prospect of their being near a termination, and of once more embracing the dearest object of our affections. I will not ask you, my beloved brother, whether you are innocent of the dreadful crime of mutiny. If the transactions of that day were as Mr. Bligh has represented them, such is my conviction of your worth and honour, that I will without hesitation stake my life on your innocence. If, on the contrary, you were concerned in such a conspiracy against your commander, I shall be as firmly persuaded his conduct was the occasion of it. But, alas! could any occasion justify so atrocious an attempt to destroy a number of our fellow creatures? No, my ever dearest brother, nothing but conviction from your own mouth can possibly persuade me that you would commit an action in the smallest degree inconsistent with honour and duty, and the circumstance of your having swam off to the Pandora on her arrival at Otaheite, which filled us with joy to which no words can do justice, is sufficient to convince all who know you that you certainly stayed behind either by force or from views of preservation. How strange does it seem to me that I am now engaged in the delightful task of writing to you. Alas, my beloved brother, 2 years ago I never expected again to enjoy such a felicity, and even yet I am in the most painful uncertainty whether you are alive. Gracious God, grant that we may be at length blessed by your return. But alas! the Pandora's people have been long expected, and are not even yet arrived. Should any accident have happened after all the miseries you have already suffered, the poor gleam of hope with which we have been lately indulged will render our situation 10,000 times more insupportable than if time had inured us to your loss. I send this to the care of Mr. Hayward of Hackney, father to the young gentleman you so often mention in your letters, while you were on board the Bounty, and who went out as third lieutenant of the Pandora, a circumstance which gave us infinite satisfaction, as you would, on entering the Pandora, meet your old friend. On discovering old Mr. Hayward's residence, I wrote to him, as I hoped he could give me some information respecting the time of your arrival, and in return he sent me a most friendly letter, and has promised this shall be given to you when you reach England, as I well know how great must be your anxiety to hear of us, and how much satisfaction it will give you to have a letter immediately on your return. Let me conjure you, my dearest Peter, to write to us the very first moment. Do not lose a post. 'Tis of no consequence how short your letter may be, if it only informs us you are well. I need not tell you that you are the first and dearest object of our affections. Think then, my adored boy, of the anxiety we must feel on your account. For my own part I can know no real joy or happiness independent of you, and if any misfortune should now deprive us of you, my hopes of felicity are fled for ever. We are at present making all possible interest with every friend and connection we have, to ensure you a sufficient support and protection at your approaching trial, for a trial you must unavoidably undergo, in order to convince the world of that innocence which those who know you will not for a moment doubt. But alas! while circumstances are against you, the generality of mankind will judge severely. Bligh's representations to the Admiralty are, I am told, very unfavourable, and hitherto the tide of public opinion has been greatly in his favour. My mamma is at present well, considering the distress she has suffered since you left us; for, my dearest brother, we have experienced a complicated scene of misery from a variety of causes, which, however, when compared with the sorrow we felt on your account, was trifling and insignificant. That misfortune made all others light, and to see you once more returned and safely restored to us will be the summit of all earthly happiness. Farewell, my most beloved brother. God grant this may soon be put into your hands. Perhaps at this moment you are arrived in England, and I may soon have the dear delight of again beholding you. My mamma, brothers, and sisters join with me in every sentiment of love and tenderness. Write to us immediately, my ever loved Peter, and may the Almighty preserve you until you bless with your presence your fondly affectionate family, and particularly your unalterably faithful friend and sister, Nessy Heywood. The gleam of joy which this unhappy family derived from the circumstance, which had been related to them, of young Heywood's swimming off to the Pandora, was dissipated by a letter from himself to his mother, soon after his arrival in England, in which he says: "The question, my dear mother, in one of your letters, concerning my swimming off to the Pandora, is one falsity among the too many, in which I have often thought of undeceiving you, and as frequently forgot. The story was this. On the morning she arrived, accompanied by two of my friends, natives, I was going up the mountains, and having got about 100 yards from my own house, another of my friends, for I was a universal favourite among those Indians, and perfectly conversant in their language, came running after me, and informed me there was a ship coming. I immediately ascended a rising ground, and saw, with indescribable joy, a ship laying to off Hapiano. It was just after daylight, and thinking Coleman might not be awake, and therefore ignorant of this pleasing news, I sent one of my servants to inform him of it, upon which he immediately went off in a single canoe. There was a fresh breeze, and the ship working into the bay. He no sooner got alongside than the rippling capsized the canoe, and he, being obliged to let go the tow rope to get her righted, went astern, and was picked up the next tack, and taken on board the Pandora, he being the first person. I, along with my messmate Stewart, was then standing upon the beach with a double canoe, manned with 12 paddles, ready for launching, and just as she made her last tack into her berth, for we did not think it requisite to go off sooner, we put off and got alongside just as they streamed the buoy, and being dressed in the country manner, tanned as brown as themselves, and I tattooed like them in the most curious manner, I do not in the least wonder at their taking us for natives. I was tattooed, not to gratify my own desire, but theirs, for it was my constant endeavour to acquiesce in any little custom which I thought would be agreeable to them, though painful in the process, provided I gained by it their friendship and esteem, which you may suppose is no inconsiderable object in an island where the natives are so numerous. The more a man or woman there is tattooed, the more they are respected, and a person having none of these marks is looked upon as bearing an unworthy badge of disgrace, and considered as a mere outcast of society. Among the many anxious friends and family connections of the Heywoods was Commodore Paisley, to whom this affectionate young lady addressed herself on the melancholy occasion, and the following is the reply she received from this officer. Sheerness, June 8th, 1792. Would to God, my dearest Nessy, that I could rejoice with you on the early prospect of your brother's arrival in England. One division of the Pandora's people has arrived, and now on board the Vengeance, my ship. Captain Edwards, with the remainder, and all the prisoners late of the Bounty, in number 10, 4 having been drowned on the loss of that ship, are daily expected. They have been most rigorously and closely confined since taken, and will continue so, no doubt, till Bligh's arrival. You have no chance of seeing him, for no bail can be offered. Your intelligence of his swimming off on the Pandora's arrival is not founded. A man of the name of Coleman swam off ere she anchored, your brother and Mr. Stewart the next day. This last youth, when the Pandora was lost, refused to allow his irons to be taken off to save his life. I cannot conceal it from you, my dearest Nessy, neither is it proper I should. Your brother appears, by all accounts, to be the greatest culprit of all, Christian alone excepted. Every exertion, you may rest assured, I shall use to save his life, but on trial I have no hope of his not being condemned. 3 of the 10 who are expected are mentioned in Bligh's narrative, as men detained against their inclination. Would to God your brother had been one of that number! I will not distress you more by enlarging on this subject. As intelligence arises on their arrival, you shall be made acquainted. Adieu, my dearest Nessy. Present my affectionate remembrances to your mother and sisters, and believe me always, with the warmest affection, your uncle, Thomas Paisley. How unlike is this from the letter of Bligh! While it frankly apprises this amiable lady of the real truth of the case, without disguise, as it was then understood to be from Mr. Bligh's representations, it assures her of his best exertions to save her brother's life. Every reader of sensibility will sympathise in the feeling displayed in her reply. Isle of Man, 22nd of June, 1792. Harassed by the most torturing suspense, and miserably wretched as I have been, my dearest uncle, since the receipt of your last, conceive, if it is possible, the heartfelt joy and satisfaction we experienced yesterday morning, when, on the arrival of the packet, the dear delightful letter from our beloved Peter, a copy of which I send you enclosed, was brought to us. Surely, my excellent friend, you will agree with me in thinking there could not be a stronger proof of his innocence and worth, and that it must prejudice every person who reads it most powerfully in his favour. Such a letter, in less distressful circumstances than those in which he writes, would, I am persuaded, reflect honour on the pen of a person much older than my poor brother. But when we consider his extreme youth, only 16 at the time of the mutiny, and now but 19, his fortitude, patience, and manly resignation under the pressure of sufferings and misfortunes almost unheard of, and scarcely to be supported at any age, without the assistance of that which seems to be my dear brother's greatest comfort, a quiet conscience, and a thorough conviction of his own innocence, when I add at the same time with real pleasure and satisfaction that his relation corresponds in many particulars with the accounts we have hitherto heard of the fatal mutiny, and when I also add, with inconceivable pride and delight, that my beloved Peter never was known to breathe a syllable inconsistent with truth and honour, when these circumstances, my dear uncle, are all united, what man on earth can doubt of the innocence which could dictate such a letter? In short, let it speak for him. The perusal of his artless and pathetic story will, I am persuaded, be a stronger recommendation in his favour than anything I can urge. I need not tire your patience, my ever-loved uncle, by dwelling longer on this subject, the dearest and most interesting on earth to my heart. Let me conjure you only, my kind friend, to read it, and consider the innocence and defenceless situation of its unfortunate author, which calls for, and I am sure deserves, all the pity and assistance his friends can afford him, and which, I am sure also, the goodness and benevolence of your heart will prompt you to exert in his behalf. It is perfectly unnecessary for me to add, after the anxiety I feel, and cannot but express, that no benefit conferred upon myself will be acknowledged with half the gratitude I must ever feel for the smallest instance of kindness shown to my beloved Peter. Farewell, my dearest uncle. with the firmest reliance on your kind and generous promises, I am, ever with the truest gratitude and sincerity, your most affectionate niece, Nessy Hayward. End of Chapter 4, Part 3.
Chapter 5 The Pandora Part 1 Of the Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Haley Flagg. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 5, Part 1. Oh, I have suffered with those that I saw suffer. A brave vessel who had, no doubt, some noble creatures in her, dashed all to pieces. Oh, the cry did knock against my very heart. Poor souls, they perished. Had I been any god of power, I would have sunk the sea within the earth, or ere it should the good ship so have swallowed, and the freighting souls within her. The tide of public applause set as strongly in favour of Bligh, on account of his sufferings and the successful issue of his daring enterprise, as its indignation was launched against Christian and his associates for the audacious and criminal deed they had committed. Bligh was promoted by the Admiralty to the rank of commander, and speedily sent out a second time to transport the breadfruit to the West Indies, which he without the least obstruction successfully accomplished. And his Majesty's government were no sooner made acquainted with the atrocious act of piracy and mutiny, than it determined to adopt every possible means to apprehend and bring to condign punishment the perpetrators of so foul a deed. For this purpose, the Pandora frigate of 24 guns and 160 men was dispatched under the command of Captain Edward Edwards, with orders to proceed in the first instance to Otaheite, and not finding the mutineers there, to visit the different groups of the Society and Friendly Islands, and others in the neighbouring parts of the Pacific, using his best endeavours to seize and bring home in confinement the whole or such part of the delinquents as he might be able to discover. This voyage was in the sequel almost as disastrous as that of the Bounty, but from a different cause. The waste of human life was much greater, occasioned by the wreck of the ship, and the distress experienced by the crew not much less, owing to the famine and thirst they had to suffer in a navigation of 1100 miles in open boats. But the captain succeeded in fulfilling a part of his instructions by taking 14 of the mutineers, of whom 10 were brought safe to England, the other 4 being drowned when the ship was wrecked. The only published account of this voyage is contained in a small volume by Mr. George Hamilton, the surgeon, who appears to have been a coarse, vulgar, and illiterate man, more disposed to relate licentious scenes and adventures, in which he and his companions were engaged, than to give any information of proceedings and occurrences connected with the main object of the voyage. From this book, therefore, much information is not to be looked for. In a more modern publication, many abusive epithets have been bestowed on Captain Edwards, and observations made on the conduct of this officer highly injurious to his reputation, in regards to his inhuman treatment of, and disgraceful acts of cruelty towards, his prisoners, which, it is to be feared, have but too much foundation in fact. The account of his proceedings, rendered by himself to the Admiralty, is vague and unsatisfactory, and had it not been for the journal of Morrison and a circumstantial letter of young Heywood to his mother, no record would have remained of the unfeeling conduct of this officer towards his unfortunate prisoners, who were treated with a rigour which could not be justified on any ground of necessity or prudence. The Pandora anchored on Matavai Bay on the 23rd March, 1791. Captain Edwards, in his narrative, states that Joseph Coleman, the armourer of the Bounty, attempted to come on board before the Pandora had anchored; that on reaching the ship he began to make inquiries of him after the Bounty and her people, and that he seemed to be ready to give him any information that was required; that the next who came on board just after the ship had anchored were Mr. Peter Heywood and Mr. Stewart, before any boat had been sent on shore; that they were brought down to his cabin, when, after some conversation, Heywood asked if Mr. Hayward, midshipman of the Bounty, but now lieutenant of the Pandora, was on board, as he had heard that he was. That Lieutenant Hayward, whom he sent for, treated Heywood with a sort of contemptuous look, and began to enter into conversation with him respecting the bounty. But Edwards ordered him to desist, and called in the sentinel to take the prisoners into safe custody, and put them in irons. That 4 other mutineers soon made their appearance, and that from them and some of the natives he learned that the rest of the bounty's people had built a schooner, with which they had sailed the day before from Mutiny Bay to the northwest part of the island. He goes on to say that, on this intelligence, he dispatched the 2 lieutenants, Corner and Hayward, with the pinnace and launch to endeavour to intercept her. They soon got sight of her and chased her out to sea, but the schooner gained so much upon them, and night coming on, they were compelled to give up the pursuit and return to the ship. It was soon made known, however, that she had returned to Papeete, on which they were again dispatched in search of her. Lieutenant Corner had taken 3 of the mutineers, and Hayward, on arriving at Papeete, found the schooner there, but the mutineers had abandoned her and fled to the mountains. He carried off the schooner, and returned next day, when he learned they were not far off, and the following morning, on hearing they were coming down, he drew up his party in order to receive them, and when within hearing called to them to lay down their arms and to go on one side, which they did, when they were confined and brought as prisoners to the ship. The following were the persons received on board the Pandora: Peter Heywood, midshipman; George Stewart, midshipman; James Morrison, boatswain's mate; Charles Norman, carpenter's mate; Thomas Mackintosh, carpenter's crew; Joseph Coleman, armourer; Richard Skinner, Thomas Ellison, Henry Hillbrant, Thomas Burkitt, John Millward, John Sumner, William Musprat, Michael Byrne, all seamen. In all, 14. The other 2, which made up the 16 that had been left on the island, were murdered, as will appear presently. Captain Edwards will himself explain how he disposed of his prisoners. "I put the pirates," he says, "into a round house which I built on the after part of the quarter deck, for their more effectual security in this airy and healthy situation, and to separate them from, and to prevent their having communication with, or to crowd and incommode, the ship's company." Dr. Hamilton calls it the most desirable place in the ship, and adds that orders were given that the prisoners should be victualled in every respect, the same as the ship's company, both in meat, liquor, and all the extra indulgences with which they were so liberally supplied, notwithstanding the established laws of the service, which restrict prisoners to 2/3 allowance. But Captain Edwards very humanely commiserated their unhappy and inevitable length of confinement. Mr. Morrison, one of the prisoners, gives a very different account of their treatment from that of Edwards or Hamilton. He says that Captain Edwards put both legs of the 2 midshipmen in irons, and that he branded them with the opprobrious epithet of piratical villains; that they, with the rest, being strongly handcuffed, were put into a kind of round house, only 11 feet long, built as a prison, and aptly named Pandora's Box, which was entered by a scuttle in the roof, about 18 inches square. This was done in order that they might be kept separate from the crew, and also the more effectually to prevent them from having any communication with the natives; that such of those friendly creatures as ventured to look pitifully towards them were instantly turned out of the ship, and never again allowed to come on board. But 2 sentinels were kept constantly upon the roof of the prison, with orders to shoot the first of its inmates who should attempt to address another in the Otaheitean dialect. That Captain Edwards took every precaution to keep his prisoners in safe custody, and placed them in confinement, as by his instructions he was directed to do, may be well imagined. End note 14. But Mr. Morrison will probably be thought to go somewhat beyond credibility in stating that orders were given to shoot any of the prisoners, when confined in irons. Captain Edwards must have known that such an act would have cost him his commission or something more. The fact is, that information was given to Edwards, at least he so asserts, that the brother of the King of Otaheite, an intelligent chief, that a conspiracy was formed among the natives to cut the ship's cables the first strong wind that should blow on the shore, which was considered to be the more probable, as many of the prisoners were said to be married to the most respectable chief's daughters in the district opposite to the anchorage; that the midshipman Stewart, in particular, had married the daughter of a man of great landed property near Mutiny Bay. This intelligence, no doubt, weighed with the captain in giving his orders for the close confinement of the prisoners, and particularly in restricting the visits of the natives. But so far is it from being true that all communication between the mutineers and the natives was cut off, that we are distinctly told by Mr. Hamilton that The prisoners' wives visited the ship daily, and brought their children, who were permitted to be carried to their unhappy fathers. To see the poor captives in irons, he says, weeping over their tender offspring, was too moving a scene for any feeling heart. Their wives brought them ample supplies of every delicacy that the country afforded, while we lay there, and behaved with the greatest fidelity and affection to them. End note 15. Of the fidelity and attachment of these simple-minded creatures, an instance is afforded of the affecting story which is told in the first missionary voyage of the Duff, of the unfortunate wife of the reputed mutineer, Mr. Stewart. It would seem also to exonerate Edwards from some part of the charges which have been brought against him. The history of Peggy Stewart marks a tenderness of heart that never will be heard without emotion. She was the daughter of a chief, and taken for his wife by Mr. Stewart, one of the unhappy mutineers. They had lived with the old chief in the most tender state of endearment. A beautiful little girl had been the fruit of their union, and was at the breast when the Pandora arrived, seized the criminals, and secured them in irons on board the ship. Frantic with grief, the unhappy Peggy, for so he had named her, flew with her infant in a canoe to the arms of her husband. The interview was so affecting and afflicting, that the officers on board were overwhelmed with anguish, and Stewart himself, unable to bear the heart-rending scene, begged she might not be admitted again on board. She was separated from him by violence, and conveyed on shore in a state of despair and grief too big for utterance. Withheld from him, and forbidden to come any more on board, she sunk into the deepest dejection. It preyed on her vitals. She lost all relish for food and life, rejoiced no more, pined under a rapid decay of 2 months, and fell a victim to her feelings, dying literally of a broken heart. Her child is yet alive, and a tender object of our care, having been brought up by a sister, who nursed it as her own, and has discharged all the duties of an affectionate mother to the orphan infant. End note 16. It does not appear that young Heywood formed any matrimonial engagement during his abode in Otaheite. He was not, however, insensible to the amiable and good qualities of these people. In some laudatory verses which he wrote while on the island, their numerous good qualities are spoken of in terms of the highest commendation. All the mutineers that were left on the island being received on board the Pandora, that ship proceeded in search of those who had gone away in the Bounty. It may be mentioned, however, that 2 of the most active in the mutiny, Churchill and Thompson, had perished on the island before her arrival by violent deaths. These 2 men had accompanied a chief, who was the Tayo, or sworn friend of Churchill, and having died without children, this mutineer succeeded to his property and dignity, according to the custom of the country. Thompson, for some real or fancied insult, took an opportunity of shooting his companion. The natives assembled, and came to a resolution to avenge the murder, and literally stoned Thompson to death, and his skull was brought on board the Pandora. This horrible wretch had some time before slain a man and a child through mere wantonness, but escaped punishment by a mistake that had nearly proved fatal to young Heywood. It seems that the description of a person in Otaheite is usually given by some distinguishing figure of the tattoo, and Heywood, having the same mark as Thompson, was taken for him, and just as the club was raised to dash out his brains, the interposition of the old chief, with whom he was travelling round the island, was just in time to avert the blow. Captain Edwards had no clue to guide him as to the route taken by the Bounty, but he learnt from different people and from journals kept on board that ship, which were found in the chests of the mutineers at Otaheite, the proceedings of Christian and his associates after Lieutenant Bligh and his companions had been turned adrift in the launch. From these it appears that the pirates proceeded in the first instance to the island of Tubuai, in latitudes 20 degrees 13 minutes south, longitude 149 degrees 35 minutes west, where they anchored on the 25th of May, 1789. They had thrown overboard the greater part of the breadfruit plants, and divided among themselves the property of the officers and men who had been so inhumanly turned adrift. At this island they intended to form a settlement, but the opposition of the natives, the want of many necessary materials, and quarrels among themselves, determined them to go to Otaheite to procure what might be required to effect their purpose, provided they should agree to prosecute their original intention. They accordingly sailed from Tubuai about the latter end of the month, and arrived at Otaheite on the 6th of June. The Otu, or reigning sovereign, and other principal natives, were very inquisitive and anxious to know what had become of Lieutenant Bligh and the rest of the crew, and also what had been done with the breadfruit plants. They were told they had most unexpectedly fallen in with Captain Cook at an island he had just discovered, called Waitutaki, where he intended to form a settlement, and where the plants had been landed, and that Lieutenant Bligh and the others were stopping there to assist Captain Cook in the business he had in hand, and that he had appointed Mr. Christian commander of the Bounty, and that he was now come by his orders for an additional supply of hogs, goats, fowls, breadfruit, and various other articles which Otaheite could supply. This artful story was quite sufficient to impose on the credulity of the humane and simple-minded islanders, and so overcome with joy were they to hear that their old friend Captain Cook was alive, and about to settle so near them, that every possible means were forthwith made use of to procure the things that were wanted, so that in the course of a few days the Bounty received on board 312 hogs, 38 goats, 8 dozen of fowls, a bull and a cow, and a large quantity of breadfruit, plantains, bananas, and other fruits. They also took with them 8 men, 9 women, and 7 boys. With these supplies they left Otaheite on the 19th of June, and arrived a second time at Toobouai on the 26th. They warped the ship up the harbour, landed the livestock, and set about building a fort of 50 yards square. While this work was carrying on, quarrels and disagreements were daily happening among them, and continual disputes and skirmishes were taking place with the natives, generally brought on by the violent conduct of the invaders, and by depredations committed on their property. Retaliations were attempted by the natives without success, numbers of whom, being pursued with firearms, were put to death. Still, the situation of the mutineers became so disagreeable and unsafe, the work went on so slowly and reluctantly, that the building of the fort was agreed to be discontinued. Christian, in fact, had very soon perceived that his authority was on the wane, and that no peaceful establishment was likely to be accomplished at Toobouai. He therefore held a consultation as to what would be the most advisable step to take. After much angry discussion, it was at length determined that Toobouai should be abandoned, that the ship should once more be taken to Otaheite, and that those who might choose to go on shore there might do so, and those who preferred to remain in the ship might proceed in her to whatever place they should agree upon among themselves. In consequence of this determination, they sailed from Toobouai on the 15th, and arrived at Matavai Bay on the 20th of September, 1789. Here 16 of the mutineers were put on shore, at their own request, 14 of whom were received on board the Pandora, and 2 of them, as before mentioned, were murdered on the island. The remaining 9 agreed to continue in the Bounty. The small arms, powder, canvas, and the small stores belonging to the ship were equally divided among the whole crew. The Bounty sailed finally from Otaheite on the night of the 21st of September, and was last seen the following morning to the northwest of Point Venus. They took with them 7 Otaheitan men and 12 women. It was not even conjectured whither they meant to go, but Christian had frequently been heard to say that his object was to discover some unknown or uninhabited island, in which there was no harbour for shipping, that he would run the Bounty on shore, and make use of her materials to form a settlement. But this was the only account, vague as it was, that could be procured to direct Captain Edwards in his intended search. It appears that when the schooner, of which we have spoken, had been finished, 6 of the 14 mutineers that were left on Otaheite embarked in her, with the intention of proceeding to the East Indies, and actually put to sea. But meeting with bad weather, and suspecting the nautical abilities of Morrison, whom they had elected as commanding officer to conduct her in safety, they resolved on returning to Otaheite. Morrison, it seems, first undertook the construction of this schooner, being himself a tolerable mechanic, in which he was assisted by the 2 carpenters, the cooper, and some others. To this little band of architects, we are told, Morrison acted both as director and chaplain, distinguishing the Sabbath day by reading to them the church liturgy, and hoisting the British colours on a flagstaff erected near the scene of their operations. Conscious of his innocence, his object is stated to have been that of reaching Batavia in time to secure a passage home in the next fleet bound to Holland, but that their return was occasioned, not by any distrust of Morrison's talents, but by a refusal, on the part of the natives, to give them a sufficient quantity of matting and other necessaries for so long a voyage, being, in fact, desirous of retaining them on the island. Stewart and young Heywood took no part in this transaction, having made up their minds to remain at Otaheite, and there to await the arrival of a king's ship, it being morally certain that ere long one would be sent out thither to search for them, whatever might have been the fate of Bligh and his companions, and that this was really their intention is evident by the alacrity they displayed on getting on board the Pandora the moment of her arrival. On the 8th of May this frigate left Otaheite, accompanied by the little schooner which the mutineers had built, and the history of which is somewhat remarkable. In point of size she was not a great deal larger than Lieutenant Bligh's launch, her dimensions being 30 feet length of keel, 35 length on deck, 9 feet and a half extreme breadth, 5 feet depth of the hold. She parted from the Pandora near the Palmerston Islands, when searching for the Bounty, and was not heard of till the arrival of the Pandora's crew at Samarang in Java, where they found her lying at anchor, the crew having suffered so dreadfully from famine and the want of water, that one of the young gentlemen belonging to her became delirious. She was a remarkably swift sailor, and being afterwards employed in the sea otter trade, is stated to have made one of the quickest passages ever known from China to the Sandwich Islands. This memorable little vessel was purchased at Canton by the late Captain Broughton, to assist him in his surveying the coast of Tartary, and became the means of preserving the crew of His Majesty's ship Providence, amounting to 112 men, when wrecked to the eastward of Formosa, in the year 1797. The Pandora called at numerous islands without success, but on Lieutenant Corner having landed on one of the Palmerston's group, he found a yard and some spars with the broad arrow upon them, and marked Bounty. This induced the captain to cause a very minute search to be made in all these islands, in the course of which the Pandora, being driven out to sea by blowing weather, and very thick and hazy, lost sight of the little tender and a jolly boat, the latter of which was never more heard of. This gives occasion to a little splenetic effusion from a writer in a periodic journal, endnote 17, which was hardly called for. "When this boat," says the writer, "with a midshipman and several men, 4, had been inhumanly ordered from alongside, it was known that there was nothing in her but one piece of salt beef compassionately thrown in by a seaman, and horrid as must have been their fate, the flippant surgeon, after detailing the disgraceful fact, adds that this is the way the world was peopled, or words to that effect, for we quote only from memory." The following is quoted from the book. "It may be difficult to surmise," says the surgeon, "what has been the fate of those unfortunate men. They had a piece of salt beef thrown into the boat on them leaving the ship, and it rained a good deal that night and the following day, which might satiate their thirst. It is by these accidents the divine ruler of the universe has peopled the southern hemisphere." This is no more than asserting an acknowledged fact that can hardly admit of a dispute, and there appears nothing in the paragraph which at all affects the character of Captain Edwards, against whom it is levelled. After a fruitless search of 3 months, the Pandora arrived, on the 29th of August, on the coast of New Holland, and close to that extraordinary reef of coral rocks called the Barrier Reef, which runs along the greater part of the eastern coast, but at a considerable distance from it. The boat had been sent out to look for an opening, which was soon discovered, but in the course of the night the ship had drifted past it. "On getting soundings," said Captain Edwards in his narrative laid before the court-martial, "the topsails were filled, but before the tacks were hauled on board and the other sails made and trimmed, the ship struck upon a reef. We had a quarter less 2 fathoms on the larboard side, and 3 fathoms on the starboard side. The sails were braced about different ways to endeavour to get her off, but to no purpose. They were then clewed up and afterwards furled, the topgallant yards got down and the topgallant mast struck. Boats were hoisted out with a view to carry out an anchor, but before that could be effected the ship struck so violently on the reef that the carpenter reported she made 18 inches of water in 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes after this that there were 4 feet of water in the hold. Finding the leak increasing so fast that it was thought necessary to turn the hands to the pumps, and to bail at the different hatchways, but she still continued to gain upon us so fast that in little more than an hour and a half after she struck, there were 8 feet and a half of water in the hold. About 10 we perceived that the ship had beaten over the reef, and was in 10 fathoms water. We therefore let go the small bower anchor, cleared away a cable, and let go the best bower anchor in 15½ fathoms water underfoot, to steady the ship. Some of her guns were thrown overboard, and the water gained upon us only in a small degree, and we flattered ourselves that by the assistance of a thrum topsail, which we were preparing to haul under the ship's bottom, we might be able to lessen the leak and to free her of water. But these flattering hopes did not continue long, for, as she settled in the water, the leak increased again, and in so great a degree that there was reason to apprehend she would sink before daylight. During the night 2 of the pumps were unfortunately for some time rendered useless. One of them, however, was repaired, and we continued bailing and pumping the remainder of the night, and every effort that was thought of was made to keep afloat and preserve the ship. Daylight fortunately appeared, and gave us the opportunity of seeing our situation and the surrounding danger, and it was evident the ship had been carried to the northward by a tide or current. The officers, whom I had consulted on the subject of our situation, gave it as their opinion that nothing more could be done for the preservation of the ship. It then became necessary to endeavour to provide and to find means for the preservation of the people. Our 4 boats, which consisted of 1 launch, 1 8-oared pinnace, and 2 6-oared yawls, with careful hands in them, were kept astern of the ship. A small quantity of bread, water, and other necessary articles were put into them. 2 canoes, which we had on board, were lashed together and put into the water. Rafts were made, and all floating things upon deck were unlashed. About 6:30 in the morning of the 29th the hold was full, and the water was between decks, and had also washed in at the upper deck ports, and there were strong indications that the ship was on the very point of sinking, and we began to leap overboard and take to the boats, and before everybody could get out of her she actually sunk. The boats continued astern of the ship in the direction of the drift of the tide from her, and took up the people that had hold of rafts and other floating things that had been cast loose, for the purpose of supporting them in the water. The double canoe, that was able to support a considerable number of men, broke adrift with only 1 man, and was bulged upon a reef, and afforded us no assistance when she was so much wanted on this trying and melancholy occasion. 2 of the boats were laden with men and sent to a small sandy island, or key, about 4 miles from the wreck, and I remained near the ship for some time with the other 2 boats, and picked up all the people that could be seen, and then followed the 2 first boats to the quay, and having landed the men and cleared the boats, they were immediately dispatched again to look about the wreck and the adjoining reef for any that might be missing, but they returned without having found a single person. On mustering the people that was saved, it appeared that 89 of the ship's company, and 10 of the mutineers that had been prisoners on board, answered to their names, but 31 of the ship's company, and 4 mutineers, were lost with the ship. It is remarkable enough that so little notice is taken of the mutineers in this narrative of the captain, and as the following statement is supposed to come from the late Lieutenant Corner, who was second lieutenant of the Pandora, it is entitled to be considered as authentic, and if so, Captain Edwards must have deserved the character ascribed to him of being altogether destitute of the common feelings of humanity. 3 of the Bounty's people, Coleman, Norman, and Mackintosh, were now let out of irons and set to work at the pumps. The others afforded their assistance and begged to be allowed a chance of saving their lives, instead of which 2 additional sentinels were placed over them, with orders to shoot any who should attempt to get rid of their fetters. Seeing no prospect of escape, they betook themselves to prayer and prepared to meet their fate, every one expecting that the ship would soon go to pieces, her rudder and part of the stern post being already beat away. When the ship was actually sinking, and every effort making for the preservation of the crew, it is asserted that no notice was taken of the prisoners, as is falsely stated by the author of Pandora's Voyage, although Captain Edwards was entreated by Mr. Heywood to have mercy upon them, when he passed over their prison, to make his own escape, the ship then lying on her broadside, with the larboard bow completely under water. Fortunately the master-at-arms, either by accident or design, when slipping from the roof of Pandora's box into the sea, let the keys of the irons fall through the scuttle or entrance, which he had just before opened, and thus enabled them to commence their own liberation, in which they were generously assisted, at the imminent risk of his own life, by William Moulter, a boatswain's mate, who clung to the coamings and pulled the long bars through the shackles, saying he would set them free, or go to the bottom with them. Scarcely was this effected when the ship went down, leaving nothing visible but the topmast cross-trees. The master-at-arms and all the sentinels sunk to rise no more. The cries of them and the other drowning men were awful in the extreme, and more than half an hour had elapsed before the survivors could be taken up by the boats. Among the former were Mr. Stewart, John Sumner, Richard Skinner, and Henry Hillbrant, the whole of whom perished with their hands still in manacles. On this melancholy occasion Mr. Heywood was the last person but 3 who escaped from the prison, into which the water had already found its way through the bulkhead scuttles. Jumping overboard, he seized a plank and was swimming towards a small sandy quay, about 3 miles distant, when a boat picked him up, and conveyed him thither in a state of nudity. It is worthy of remark that James Morrison endeavoured to follow his young companion's example, and, although handcuffed, managed to keep afloat until a boat came to his assistance. This account would appear almost incredible. It is true, men are sometimes found to act the part of inhuman monsters, but then they are generally actuated by some motive or extraordinary excitement. Here, however, there was neither, but on the contrary, the condition of the poor prisoners appealed more forcibly to the mercy and humanity of their jailer. The surgeon of the ship states, in his account of her loss, that as soon as the spars, booms, hencoops, and other buoyant articles were cut loose, the prisoners were ordered to be let out of the irons. One would imagine, indeed, that the officers, on this dreadful emergency, would not be witness to such inhumanity, without remonstrating effectually against keeping these unfortunate men confined a moment beyond the period when it became evident that the ship must sink. It will be seen, however, presently, from Mr. Heywood's own statement, that they were so kept, and that the brutal and unfeeling conduct which has been imputed to Captain Edwards is but too true. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Recording by Haley Flagg of Texas. Chapter 5, The Pandora, Part 2. Of the eventful history of the mutiny and piratical seizure of HMS Bounty, its cause and consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Haley Flagg. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 5, Part 2. It is an awful moment when a ship takes her last heel, just before going down. When the Pandora sunk, the surgeon says, the crew had just time to leap overboard, accompanying it with most dreadful yell. The cries of the men drowning in the water was at first awful in the extreme, but as they sunk and became faint, they died away by degrees. How accurately has Byron described the whole progress of a shipwreck to the final catastrophe! He might have been a spectator of the Pandora at the moment of her foundering, when she gave a heel and then a lurch to port, and, going down head foremost, sunk. Then rose from sea to sky the wild farewell, then shrieked the timid and stood still the brave. Then some leaped overboard with dreadful yell, as eager to anticipate their grave. And the sea yawned around her like a hell, and down she sucked with her the whirling wave, like one who grapples with his enemy, and strives to strangle him before he die. And first one universal shriek there rushed, louder than the loud ocean, like a crash of echoing thunder, and then all was hushed, save the wild wind and the remorseless dash of billows. But at intervals there gushed, accompanied with a convulsive splash, a solitary shriek, the bubbling cry of some strong swimmer in his agony. On the sandy quay which fortunately presented itself, the shipwrecked seamen hauled up the boats, to repair those that were damaged, and to stretch canvas round the gunwales, the better to keep out the sea from breaking into them. The heat of the sun and the reflection from the sand are described as excruciating, and the thirst of the men was rendered intolerable, from their stomachs being filled with salt water in the length of time they had to swim before being picked up. Mr. Hamilton says they were greatly disturbed in the night by the irregular behaviour of one of the seamen, named Connell, which made them suspect he had got drunk with some wine that had been saved. But it turned out that the excruciating torture he suffered from thirst had induced him to drink salt water, by which means he went mad and died in the sequel of the voyage. It seems a small keg of water and some biscuits had been thrown into one of the boats, which they found by calculation would be sufficient to last 16 days, on an allowance of 2 wine-glasses of water per day to each man, and a very small quantity of bread, the weight of which was accurately ascertained by a musket ball, and a pair of wooden scales made for each boat. The crew and the prisoners were now distributed among the 4 boats. At Bligh's mountainous island they entered a bay where swarms of natives came down and made signs for their landing, but this they declined to do, on which an arrow was discharged and struck one of the boats. and as the savages were seen to be collecting their bows and arrows, a volley of muskets, a few of which happened to be in the boats, was discharged, which put them to flight. While sailing among the islands and near the shore, they now and then stopped to pick up a few oysters and procure a little fresh water. On the 2nd of December they passed the northwest point of New Holland, and launched into the great Indian Ocean, having a voyage of about 1,000 miles still to perform. It will be recollected that Captain Bligh's people received warmth and comfort by wringing out their clothes in salt water. The same practice was adopted by the crews of the Pandora's boats, but the doctor observes that this wetting their bodies with salt water is not advisable, if protracted beyond 3 or 4 days, as, after that time, the great absorption from the skin that takes place taints the fluids with the bitter part of salt water, so that the saliva becomes intolerable in the mouth. Their mouths, indeed, he says, became so parched that few attempted to eat the slender allowance of bread. He also remarks that as the sufferings of the people continued, their temper became cross and savage. In the captain's boat, it is stated, one of the mutineers took to praying, but that the captain, suspecting the purity of his doctrines, and unwilling that he should have a monopoly of the business, gave prayers himself. On the 13th they saw the island of Timor, and the next morning landed and got some water, and a few small fish from the natives, and on the night of the 15th anchored opposite the fort of Coupang. Nothing could exceed the kindness and hospitality of the governor and other Dutch officers of this settlement in affording every possible assistance and relief in their distressed condition. Having remained here 3 weeks, they embarked on the 6th of October on board the Rembang Dutch Indiaman, and on the 30th anchored at Samarang, where they were agreeably surprised to find their little tender, which they had so long given up for lost. On the 7th of November they arrived at Batavia, where Captain Edwards agreed with the Dutch East India Company to divide the whole of the ship's company and prisoners among 4 of their ships proceeding to Europe. The latter the captain took with him in the Vredenburg, but finding his master ship Gorgon at the Cape, he transhipped himself and the prisoners and proceeded in her to Spithead, where he arrived on the 19th of June, 1792. Captain Edwards, in his meagre narrative, takes no more notice of his prisoners with regard to the mode in which they were disposed of at Coupang and Batavia than he does when the Pandora went down. In fact, he suppresses all information respecting them from the day in which they were consigned to Pandora's box. From this total indifference toward these unfortunate men, and their almost unparalleled sufferings, Captain Edwards must be set down as a man whose only feeling was to stick to the letter of his instructions, and rigidly to adhere to what he considered the strict line of his duty. That he was a man of a cold, phlegmatic disposition, whom no distress could move, and whose feelings were not easily disturbed by the sufferings of his fellow creatures. He appears to have been one of those mortals who might say, with Manfred, "My spirit walked not with the souls of men. My joys, my griefs, my passions, and my powers made me a stranger, though I wore the form. I had no sympathy with breathing flesh." There seems to have been a general feeling at and before the court-martial that Captain Edwards had exercised a harsh, unnecessary, and undue degree of severity on his prisoners. It is the custom, sanctioned no doubt by long usage, to place in irons all such as may have been guilty of mutiny in a ship of war, and the necessity of so doing is obvious enough, to prevent in the most effectual manner communication with the rest of the ship's company, who might be contaminated by their intercourse with such mischievous and designing men whose crime is of that dye that, if found guilty, they have little hope to escape the punishment of death, to which a mutineer must, by the naval articles of war, be sentenced. No alternative being left to a court-martial in such a case but to pronounce a sentence of acquittal or of death. In the present case, however, most of the prisoners had surrendered themselves. Many of them had taken no active part in the mutiny, and others had been forcibly compelled to remain in the ship. It was not likely, therefore, that any danger could arise from indulging them, occasionally and in turns, with a few hours of fresh air on deck. As little danger was there of their escaping, where indeed could they escape to, especially when the ship was going down at a great distance from any shore, and the nearest one known to be inhabited by savages. All or most of them were desirous of getting home, and throwing themselves on God and their country. The captain, however, had no compunctious visitings of nature to shake his purpose, which seems to have been to keep them strictly in irons during the whole passage, and to deliver them over in that state on his arrival in England. Perhaps the circumstance of the crime of piracy, being superadded to that of mutiny, may have operated on his stern nature, and induced him to inflict a greater severity of punishment than he might otherwise have done, and which he certainly did far beyond the letter and spirit of his instructions. He might have considered that in all ages, and among all nations, with the exception of some of the Greek states, piracy has been held in the utmost abhorrence, and those guilty of it treated with singular and barbarous severity, and that the most sanguinary laws were established for the protection of person and property in maritime adventure. The laws of Oleron, which were composed under the immediate direction of our Richard I, and became the common usage among maritime states whose vessels passed through British seas, are conceived in a spirit of the most barbarous cruelty. Thus, if a poor pilot, through ignorance, lost the vessel, he was either required to make full satisfaction to the merchant for damages sustained, or to lose his head. In the case of wrecks, where the lord of the coast, something like our present vice-admiral, should be found to be in league with the pilots, and run the ship on the rocks, in order to get a salvage, the said lord, the salvers, and all concerned, are declared to be accursed, and excommunicated, and punished as thieves and robbers, and the pilot condemned to be hanged upon a high gibbet, which is to abide and remain to succeeding ages, on the place where erected, as a visible caution to other ships sailing thereby. Nor was the fate of the lord of the coast less severe. His property was to be confiscated, and himself fastened to a post in the midst of his own mansion, which being fired at the four corners, were all to be burned together, the walls thereof demolished, and the spot on which it stood be converted into a market-place, for the sale only of hogs and swine, to all posterity. These and many other barbarous usages were transferred into the institutions of Wisby, which formed the jus mercatorum for a long period, and in which great care was taken for the security of ships against their crews. Among other articles are the following: Whoever draws a sword upon the master of a vessel, or wilfully falsifies the compass, shall have his right hand nailed to the mast. Whoever behaves riotously shall be punished by being keel-hauled. Whoever is guilty of rebellion or mutiny shall be thrown overboard. For the suppression of piracy, the Portuguese, in their early intercourse with India, had a summary punishment, and accompanied it with a terrible example to deter others from the commission of the crime. Whenever they took a pirate ship, they instantly hanged every man, carried away the sails, rudder, and everything that was valuable in the ship, and left her to be buffeted about by winds and waves, with the carcasses of the criminals dangling from the yards, a horrid object of terror to all who might chance to fall in with her. Even to this day, a spice of the laws of Oleron still remains in the maritime code of European nations, as far as regards mutiny and piracy; and a feeling of this kind may have operated on the mind of Captain Edwards, especially as a tendency even to mutiny, or mutinous expressions, are considered, by the usage of the service, as justifying the commander of a ship of war to put the offenders in irons. Besides, the treatment of Bligh, whose admirable conduct under the unparalleled sufferings of himself and all who accompanied him in the open boat, had roused the people of England to the highest pitch of indignation against Christian and his associates, in which Edwards no doubt participated. The following letter of Mr. Peter Heywood to his mother removes all doubt as to the character and conduct of this officer. It is an artless and pathetic tale, and, as his amiable sister says, breathes not a syllable inconsistent with truth and honour. Batavia, November 20th, 1791. My ever-honoured and dearest mother, at length the time has arrived when you are once more to hear from your ill-fated son, whose conduct at the capture of that ship in which it was my fortune to embark has, I fear, from what has since happened to me, been grossly misrepresented to you by Lieutenant Bligh, who, by not knowing the real cause of my remaining on board, naturally suspected me, unhappily for me, to be a coadjutor in the mutiny; but I never, to my knowledge, whilst under his command, behaved myself in a manner unbecoming the station I occupied, nor so much as even entertained a thought derogatory to his honour, so as to give him the least grounds for entertaining an opinion of me so ungenerous and undeserved; for I flatter myself he cannot give a character of my conduct, whilst I was under his tuition, that could merit the slightest scrutiny. Oh, my dearest mother, I hope you have not so easily credited such an account of me. Do but let me vindicate my conduct, and declare to you the true cause of my remaining in the ship, and you will then see how little I deserve censure, and how I have been injured by so gross an aspersion. I shall then give you a short and cursory account of what has happened to me since. but I am afraid to say a hundredth part of what I have got in store, for I am not allowed the use of writing materials, if known, so that this is done by stealth. And if it should ever come to your hands, it will, I hope, have the desired effect of removing your uneasiness on my account, when I assure you, before the face of God, of my innocence of what is laid to my charge. How I came to remain on board was thus. The morning the ship was taken, it being my watch below, happening to awake just after daylight, and looking out of my hammock, I saw a man sitting upon the arm-chest in the main hatchway, with a drawn cutlass in his hand, the reason of which I could not divine. So I got out of bed, and inquired of him what was the cause of it. He told me that Mr. Christian, assisted by some of the ship's company, had seized the captain and put him in confinement, had taken the command of the ship, and meant to carry Bligh home a prisoner, in order to try him by court-martial, for his long, tyrannical, and oppressive conduct to his people. I was quite thunderstruck, and hurrying into my berth again, told one of my messmates, whom I awakened out of his sleep, what had happened. Then dressing myself, I went up the fore hatchway, and saw what he had told me was but too true. And again I asked some of the people, who were under arms, what was going to be done with the captain, who was then on the larboard side of the quarter-deck, with his hands tied behind his back, and Mr. Christian alongside him with a pistol and drawn bayonet. I now heard a very different story, and that the captain was to be sent ashore to Tufua in the launch, and that those who would not join Mr. Christian might either accompany the captain, or would be taken in irons to Otaheite and left there. The relation of two stories so different left me unable to judge which could be the true one, but seeing them hoisting the boats out, it seemed to prove the latter. In this trying situation, young and inexperienced as I was, and without an adviser, every person being as it were infatuated, and not knowing what to do, I remained for a while a silent spectator of what was going on, and after revolving the matter in my mind, I determined to choose what I thought the lesser of two evils, and stay by the ship. For I had no doubt that those who went on shore in the launch would be put to death by the savage natives, whereas the Otaheitans, being a humane and generous race, one might have a hope of being kindly received, and remain there until the arrival of some ship which seemed, to silly me, the most consistent with reason and rectitude. While this resolution possessed my mind, at the same time lending my assistance to hoist out the boats, the hurry and confusion affairs were in, and thinking my intention just, I never thought of going to Mr. Bligh for advice. Besides, what confirmed me in it was, my seeing two experienced officers, when ordered into the boat by Mr. Christian, desire his permission to remain in the ship, one of whom, my own messmate, Mr. Hayward, and I being assisting to clear the launch of yams, he asked me what I intended to do. I told him to remain in the ship. Now this answer, I imagine, he has told Mr. Bligh I made to him, from which, together with my not speaking to him that morning, his suspicions of me have arisen, construing my conduct into what is foreign to my nature. Thus, my dearest mother, it was all owing to my youth and unadvised inexperience, but has been interpreted into villainy and disregard of my country's laws, the ill effects of which I at present, and still am to, labour under for some months longer. And now, after what I have asserted, I may still once more retrieve my injured reputation, be again reinstated in the affection and favour of the most tender of mothers, and be still considered as her ever dutiful son. I was not undeceived in my erroneous decision till too late, which was after the captain was in the launch, for while I was talking to the master-at-arms, one of the ringleaders in the affair, my other messmate, whom I had left in his hammock in the berth, Mr. Stewart, came up to me and asked me if I was not going in the launch. I replied no, upon which he told me not to think of such a thing as remaining behind, but take his advice, and go down below with him to get a few necessary things, and make haste to go with him into the launch, adding that, by remaining in the ship, I should incur an equal share of guilt with the mutineers themselves. I reluctantly followed his advice. I say reluctantly, because I knew no better, and was foolish. And the boat swimming very deep in the water, the land being far distant, the thoughts of being sacrificed by the natives, and the self-consciousness of my first intention being just, all these considerations almost staggered my resolution. However, I preferred my companion's judgment to my own, and we both jumped down the main hatchway to prepare ourselves for the boat. But no sooner were we in the berth than the master-at-arms ordered the sentry to keep us both in the berth till he should receive orders to release us. We desired the master-at-arms to acquaint Mr. Bligh of our intention, which we had reason to think he never did, nor were we permitted to come on deck until the launch was a long way astern. I now, when too late, saw my error. At the latter end of May we got to an island to the southward of Tahiti, called Tubui, where they intended to make a settlement, but finding no stock there of any kind, they agreed to go to Tahiti, and after procuring hogs and fowls, to return to Tubui and remain. So, on the 6th of June, we arrived at Tahiti, where I was in hopes I might find an opportunity of running away and remaining on shore, but I could not effect it, as there was always too good a look-out kept to prevent any such steps being taken. And besides, they had all sworn that should anyone make his escape, they would force the natives to restore him, and would then shoot him as an example to the rest. Well knowing that anyone by remaining there might be the means, should a ship arrive, of discovering their intended place of abode. Finding it therefore impracticable, I saw no other alternative but to rest as content as possible and return to Tubui, and there wait till the massive bounty should be taken out, and then take the boat which might carry me to Tahiti, and disable those remaining from pursuit. Endnote 20. But Providence so ordered it that we had no occasion to try our fortune at such a hazard, for, upon returning there, and remaining till the latter end of August, in which time a fort was almost built, but nothing could be effected, and as the natives could not be brought to friendly terms, and with whom we had many skirmishes, and narrow escapes from being cut off by them, and, what was still worse, internal broils and discontent, these things determined part of the people to leave the island and go to Tahiti, which was carried by a majority of votes. This being carried into execution on the 22nd of September, and being anchored in Matavai Bay, the next morning my messmate Mr. Stewart and I went on shore to the house of an old landed proprietor, our former friend, and being now set free from a lawless crew, determined to remain as much apart from them as possible, and wait patiently for the arrival of a ship. 14 more of the Bounty's people came likewise on shore, and Mr. Christian and 8 men went away with the ship, but God knows whither. Whilst we remained here, we were treated by our kind and friendly natives with a generosity and humanity almost unparalleled, and such as we could hardly have expected from the most civilized people. To be brief, having remained here till the latter end of March 1791, on the 26th of that month, His Majesty's ship Pandora arrived, and had scarcely anchored, when my messmate and I went on board, and made ourselves known. And having learnt from one of the natives who had been off in a canoe, that our former messmate Mr. Hayward, now promoted to the rank of lieutenant, was on board, we asked for him, supposing he might prove the assertions of our innocence. But he, like all worldlings when raised a little in life, received us very coolly, and pretended ignorance of our affairs. Yet formerly he and I were bound in brotherly love and friendship. Appearances being so much against us, we were ordered to be put in irons and looked upon, oh infernal words, as piratical villains. A rebuff so severe as this was, to a person unused to troubles, would perhaps have been unsupportable, but to me, who had now been long inured to the frowns of fortune, and feeling myself supported by an inward consciousness of not deserving it, it was received with the greatest composure, and a full determination to bear it with patience. My sufferings, however, I have not power to describe, but though they are great, yet I thank God for enabling me to bear them without repining. I endeavour to qualify my affliction with these 3 considerations. First, my innocence not deserving them. Secondly, that they cannot last long. And thirdly, that the change may be for the better. The first improves my hope, the second my patience, and the third my courage. I am young in years, but old in what the world calls adversity, and it has had such an effect as to make me consider it the most beneficial incident that could have occurred at my age. It has made me acquainted with 3 things which are little known, and as little believed by any but those who have felt their effects. First, the villainy and censoriousness of mankind. Secondly, the futility of all human hopes. And thirdly, the happiness of being content in whatever station it may please Providence to place me in. In short, it has made me more of a philosopher than many years of a life spent in ease and pleasure would have done. As they will, no doubt, proceed to the greatest lengths against me, I being the only surviving officer, and they most inclined to believe a prior story, all that can be said to confute it will probably be looked upon as mere falsity and invention. Should that be my unhappy case, and they resolve upon my destruction as an example to futurity, may God enable me to bear my fate with the fortitude of a man, conscious that misfortune, not any misconduct, is the cause, and that the Almighty can attest my innocence. Yet why should I despond? I have, I hope, still a friend in that Providence which hath preserved me amidst many greater dangers, and upon whom alone I now depend for safety. God will always protect those who deserve it. These are the sole considerations which have enabled me to make myself easy and content under my past misfortunes. 12 more of the people who were at Otaheite having delivered themselves up, there was a sort of prison built on the after part of the quarter-deck, into which we were all put in close confinement, with both legs and both hands in irons, and were treated with great rigour, not being allowed ever to get out of this den, and being obliged to eat, drink, sleep, and obey the calls of nature here. You may form some idea of the disagreeable situation I must have been in, unable as I was to help myself, being deprived of the use of both my legs and hands, but by no means adequate to the reality. On the 9th of May we left Otaheite and proceeded to the Friendly Islands, and about the beginning of August got in amongst the reefs of New Holland, to endeavour to discover a passage through them, but it was not effected, for the Pandora, ever unlucky, and as if devoted by Heaven to destruction, was driven by a current upon the patch of a reef, and on which, there being a heavy surf, she was soon almost bulged to pieces. But having thrown all the guns on one side overboard, and the tide flowing at the same time, she beat over the reef into a basin, and brought up in 14 or 15 fathoms. But she was so much damaged while on the reef, that imagining she would go to pieces every moment, we had contrived to wrench ourselves out of our irons, and applied to the captain to have mercy on us, and suffer us to take our chance for the preservation of our lives. But it was all in vain. He was even so inhuman as to order us all to be put in irons again, though the ship was expected to go down every moment, being scarcely able to keep her under with all the pumps at work. In this miserable situation, with an expected death before our eyes, without the least hope of relief, and in the most trying state of suspense, we spent the night, the ship being by the hand of Providence kept up till the morning. The boats by this time had all been prepared, and as the captain and officers were coming upon the poop or roof of our prison to abandon the ship, the water being then up to the coamings of the hatchways, we again implored his mercy, upon which he sent the corporal and an armourer down to let some of us out of irons, but 3 only were suffered to go up, and the scuttle being then clapped on, and the master-at-arms upon it, the armourer had only time to let 2 persons out of irons, the rest, except 3, letting themselves out. 2 of these 3 went down with them on their hands, and the third was picked up. She now began to heel over to port so very much, that the master-at-arms sliding overboard, and leaving the scuttle vacant, we all tried to get up, and I was at last out but 3. The water was then pouring in at the bulkhead scuttles, yet I succeeded in getting out, and was scarcely in the sea when I could see nothing above it but the cross trees, and nothing around me but a scene of the greatest distress. I took a plank, being stark naked, and swam towards an island about 3 miles off, but was picked up on my passage by one of the boats. When we got ashore to the small sandy quay, we found there were 34 men drowned, 4 of whom were prisoners, and among these was my unfortunate messmate Mr. Stewart. 10 of us, and 89 of the Pandora's crew, were saved. When a survey was made of what provisions had been saved, they were found to consist of 2 or 3 bags of bread, 2 or 3 beakers of water, and a little wine. So we subsisted 3 days upon 2 wine glasses of water, and 2 ounces of bread per day. On the 1st of September we left the island, and on the 16th arrived at Kupang on the island of Timor, having been on short allowance 18 days. We were put in confinement in the castle, where we remained till October, and on the 5th of that month we were sent on board a Dutch ship bound for Batavia. Though I have been 8 months in close confinement in a hot climate, I have kept my health in a most surprising manner, without the least indisposition, and am still perfectly well in every respect, in mind as well as body, but without a friend, and only a shirt and a pair of trousers to put on and carry me home. Yet with all this I have a contented mind, entirely resigned to the will of Providence, which conduct alone enables me to soar above the reach of unhappiness. In a subsequent letter to his sister, he says, "I send you 2 little sketches of the manner in which His Majesty's ship Pandora went down on the 29th of August, and of the appearance which we who survived made on the small sandy quay within the reef, about 90 yards long and 60 broad, in all 99 souls. Here we remained 3 days, subsisting on a single wine glass of wine or water, and 2 ounces of bread a day, with no shelter from the meridian and then vertical sun. Captain Edwards had tents erected for himself and his people, and we prisoners petitioned him for an old sail which was lying useless, part of the wreck, but he refused it, and the only shelter we had was to bury ourselves up to the neck in the burning sand, which scorched the skin entirely off our bodies, for we were quite naked, and we appeared as if dipped in large tubs of boiling water. We were 19 days in the same miserable situation before we landed at Kupang. I was in the ship in irons, hands and feet, much longer than till the position you now see her in, the poop alone being above the water, and that knee-deep, when a kind of providence assisted me to get out of irons and escape from her. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. Recording by Haley Flagg of Texas. Chapter 5, The Pandora, Part 3, of the eventful history of the mutiny and piratical seizure of HMS Bounty, its cause and consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Haley Flagg. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow, Chapter 5, Part 3. The treatment of these unhappy men was almost as bad at Batavia as in the Pandora, being closely confined in irons in the castle, and fed on very bad provisions. And the hardships they endured on their passage to England in Dutch ships were very severe, having, as he says, slept on nothing but hard boards on wet canvas, without any bed, for 17 months, always subsisting on short allowance of execrable provisions, and without any clothes for some time, except such as the charity of 2 young men in the ship supplied him with. He had during his confinement at Batavia learned to make straw hats, and finished several with both his hands in fetters, which he sold for half a crown apiece, and with the produce of these he procured a suit of coarse clothes, in which, with a cheerful and light heart, notwithstanding all his sufferings, he arrived at Portsmouth. How he preserved his health under the dreadful sufferings he endured, and in 8 months' close confinement in a hot climate, is quite wonderful. On the 2nd day after the arrival of the Gorgon at Spithead, the prisoners were transferred to the Hector, commanded by Captain, the late Admiral Sir George Montague, where they were treated with the greatest humanity, and every indulgence allowed that could with propriety be extended to men in their unhappy situation, until the period when they were to be arraigned before the competent authority, and put on their trials for mutiny and piracy, which did not take place until the month of September. In this period of anxious and awful suspense, a most interesting correspondence was carried on between this unfortunate youth and his numerous friends, which exhibits the character of himself and the whole family in the most amiable and affectionate colours, and in a more particular manner, of that adorable creature his sister Nessy, who in one of her letters accounts for the peculiar warmth of her attachment and expressions by their being nearly of the same age, and engaged in the same pursuits, whether of study or amusement in their juvenile years. The poor mother, on hearing of his arrival, thus addresses her unfortunate son: Isle of Man, June 29th, 1792. O my ever dearly beloved and long lost son, with what anxiety have I waited for this period! I have counted the days, hours, and even minutes, since I first heard of the horrid and unfortunate mutiny which has so long deprived me of my dearest boy. But now the happy time is come when, though I cannot have the unspeakable pleasure of seeing and embracing you, yet I hope we may be allowed to correspond. Surely there can be nothing improper in a liberty of this sort between an affectionate mother and her dutiful and beloved son, who, I am perfectly convinced, was never guilty of the crime he has been suspected of by those who did not know his worth and truth. I have not the least doubt but that the all-gracious God, who of his good providence has protected you so long, and brought you safe through so many dangers and difficulties, will still protect you, and at your trial make your innocence appear as clear as the light. All your letters have come safe to me, and to my very dear good Nessy. Ah, Peter, with what real joy did we all receive them, and how happy are we that you are now safe in England! I will endeavour, my dearest lad, to make your present situation as comfortable as possible, for so affectionate and good a son deserves my utmost attention. Nessy has written to our faithful and kind friend Mr. Hayward of Plymouth for his advice, whether it would be proper for her to come up to you. If he consents to her so doing, not a moment shall be lost, and how happy shall I be when she is with you. Such a sister as she is! Oh, Peter, she is a most valuable girl," etc. On the same day, this most valuable girl thus writes: Endnote 21. My dearest and most beloved brother, thanks to that almighty Providence which has so miraculously preserved you, your fond, anxious, and till now miserable Nessy is at last permitted to address the object of her tenderest affection in England. Oh, my admirable, my heroic boy, what have we felt on your account, yet how small, how infinitely trifling was the misery of our situation, when compared with the horror of yours! Let me now, however, with confidence, hope that the God of all mercies has not so long protected you in vain, but will at length crown your fortitude and pious resignation to his will with that peace and happiness you so richly merit. How blessed did your delightful and yet dreadful letter from Batavia make us all! Surely, my beloved boy, you could not for a moment imagine we ever supposed you guilty of the crime of mutiny. No, no, believe me, no earthly power could have persuaded us that it was possible for you to do anything inconsistent with strict honour and duty. So well did we know your amiable, steady principles, that we were assured your reasons for staying behind would turn out such as you represent them, and I firmly trust that Providence will at length restore you to those dear and affectionate friends who can know no happiness until they are blessed with your loved society. Take care of your precious health, my angelic boy. I shall soon be with you. I have written to Mr. Heywood, your and our excellent friend and protector, for his permission to go to you immediately, which my uncle Heywood, without first obtaining it, would not allow, fearing lest any precipitate step might injure you at present, and I only wait the arrival of his next letter to fly into your arms. Oh, my best beloved Peter, how I anticipate the rapture of that moment! For, alas, I have no joy, no happiness, but in your beloved society, and no hopes, no fears, no wishes, but for you. Mr. Heywood's sisters all addressed their unfortunate brother in the same affectionate but less impassioned strain, and a little trait of good feeling is mentioned, on the part of an old female servant, that shows what a happy and attached family the Heywoods were, previous to the melancholy affair in which their boy became entangled. Mrs. Heywood says, "My good honest Birkett is very well, and says your safe return has made her more happy than she has been for these 42 years she has been in our family." And Miss Nessy tells him, "Poor Birkett, the most faithful and worthiest of servants, desires me to tell you that she almost dies with joy at the thought of your safe arrival in England. What agony, my dear boy, has she felt on your account! Her affection for you knows no bounds, and her misery has indeed been extreme, but she still lives to bless your virtues." The poor prisoner thus replies, from His Majesty's ship Hector, to his beloved sisters all: "This day I had the supreme happiness of your long-expected letters, and I am not able to express the pleasure and joy they afforded me. At the sight of them my spirits, low and dejected, were at once exhilarated. My heart had long and greatly suffered from my impatience to hear of those most dear to me, and was tossed and tormented by the storms of fearful conjecture. But they are now subsided, and my bosom has at length attained that long-lost serenity and calmness it once enjoyed. For you may believe me when I say it never yet has suffered any disquiet from my own misfortunes, but from a truly anxious solicitude for, and desire to hear of, your welfare. God be thanked, you still entertain such an opinion of me as I will flatter myself I have deserved. But why do I say so? Can I make myself too worthy the affectionate praises of such amiable sisters? Oh, my Nessy, it grieves me to think I must be under the necessity, however heart-breaking to myself, of desiring you will relinquish your most affectionate design of coming to see me. It is too long and tedious a journey, and even on your arrival you would not be allowed the wished-for happiness, both to you and myself, of seeing, much less conversing with, your unfortunate brother. The rules of the service are so strict that prisoners are not permitted to have any communication with female relations. Thus even the sight of, and conversation with, so truly affectionate a sister is for the present denied me. The happiness of such an interview let us defer till a time which, please God, will arrive, when it can be enjoyed with more freedom and unobserved by the gazing eyes of an inquisitive world, which in my present place of confinement would of course not be the case. I am very happy to hear that poor old Birkett is still alive. Remember me to her, and tell her not to heave aback until God grants me the pleasure of seeing her. And now, my dear Nessy, cease to anticipate the happiness of personal communication with your poor but resigned brother, until wished-for freedom removes the indignant shackles I now bear from the feet of your fond and most affectionate brother, P.H. In a subsequent letter to his sister, he says, "Let us at present be resigned to our fate, contented with this sort of communication, and be thankful to God for having even allowed us that happiness. For be assured the present confinement is liberty, compared with what it has been for the 15 months last past." On the 15th of July, Commodore Paisley addressed the following business-like letter to Miss Heywood. "I received your letter, my dearest Nessy, with the enclosure," her brother's narrative, "but did not choose to answer it until I had made a thorough investigation, that is, seen personally all the principal evidences, which has ever since occupied my whole thoughts and time. I have also had some letters from himself, and notwithstanding he must still continue in confinement, every attention and indulgence possible is granted him by Captain Montague of the Hector, who is my particular friend. I have no doubt of the truth of your brother's narrative. The master, boatswain, gunner, and carpenter, late of the Bounty, I have seen, and have the pleasure to assure you that they are all favourable and corroborate what he says. That fellow, Captain Edwards, whose inhuman rigour of confinement I shall never forget, I have likewise seen. He cannot deny that Peter avowed himself late of the Bounty when he came voluntarily aboard. This is a favourable circumstance. I have been at the Admiralty, and read over all the depositions taken and sent home by Bligh and his officers from Batavia, likewise the court-martial on himself, in none of which appears anything against Peter. As soon as Lieutenant Heywood arrives with the remainder of the Pandora's crew, the court-martial is to take place. I shall certainly attend, and we must have an able counsellor to assist, for I will not deceive you, my dear Nessy, however favourable circumstances may appear, our martial law is severe. By the tenor of it, the man who stands neuter is equally guilty with him who lifts his arm against his captain in such cases. His extreme youth and his delivering himself up are the strong points of his defence. Adieu, my dearest Nessy. Present my love to your mother and sisters, and rest assured of my utmost exertions to extricate your brother. Your affectionate uncle, T. Paisley. This excellent man did not stop here. Knowing that sea officers have a great aversion from counsel, he writes to say, "A friend of mine, Mr. Graham, who has been secretary to the different admirals on the Newfoundland station for these 12 years, and consequently has acted as judge advocate at court-martials all that time, has offered me to attend you. He has a thorough knowledge of the service, uncommon abilities, and is a very good lawyer. He has already had most of the evidences with him. Adieu, my young friend. Keep up your spirits, and rest assured I shall be watchful for your good. My heart will be more at ease if I can get my friend Graham to go down, than if you were attended by the first counsel in England." End note 22. Mr. Graham accordingly attended, and was of the greatest service at the trial. Nessy Heywood, end note 23, having in one of her letters inquired of her brother how tall he was, and having received information on this point, expressed some surprise that he was not taller. "And so," he replies, "you are surprised I am not taller? Ah, Nessy, let me ask you this. Suppose the 2 last years of your growth had been retarded by close confinement, nearly deprived of all kinds of necessary aliment, shut up from the all-cheering light of the sun for the space of 5 months, and never suffered to breathe the fresh air, an enjoyment which Providence denies to none of his creatures, during all that time, and without any kind of exercise to stretch and supple your limbs, besides many other inconveniences which I will not pain you by mentioning. How tall should you have been, my dear sister? Answer, 4 feet nothing. But enough of nonsense." Nessy Heywood had expressed a strong desire to see her brother, but was told the rules of the service would not allow it; also that it would agitate him, when he sought to be cool and collected, to meet his approaching trial. That was quite enough. "But as for myself," she says, "no danger, no fatigue, no difficulties would deter me. I have youth and health, and excellent natural spirits. These and the strength of my affection would support me through it all. If I were not allowed to see you, yet being in the same place which contains you, would be joy inexpressible. I will not, however, any longer desire it, but will learn to imitate your fortitude and patience." Mr. Heywood of Maristow and his daughter, Mrs. Bertie, had intimated the same thing. These excellent people, from the moment of young Heywood's arrival, had shown him every kindness, supplied him with money, and, what was better, with friends, who could give him the best advice. To this worthy lady Miss Nessy Heywood thus addresses herself: "Overwhelmed with sensations of gratitude and pleasure which she is too much agitated to express, permit me, dearest madam, at my mamma's request, to offer you her and our most sincere acknowledgments for your invaluable letter, which, from the detention of the packet, she did not receive till yesterday. By a letter from my beloved brother, of the same date, we are informed that Mr. Larkham, who I suppose to be the gentleman you mention having sent to see him, has been on board the Hector, and has kindly offered him the most salutary advice relative to his present situation, for which allow me to request you will present him our best thanks. He also speaks with every expression a grateful heart can dictate of your excellent father's goodness in providing for all his wants, even before he could have received any letters from us to that purpose. Ah, my dear madam, how truly characteristic is this of kind friendship with which he has ever honoured our family! But my beloved Peter does not know that Mr. Heywood has a daughter whose generosity is equal to his own, and whose amiable compassion for his sufferings it will be as impossible for us to forget, as it is to express the admiration and gratitude it has inspired. It would, I am convinced, be unnecessary, as well as a very bad compliment to you, madam, were I to presume to point out anything particular to be done for our poor boy, as I have not the least doubt your goodness and kind intention have long ago rendered every care of that sort on our part unnecessary. I shall only add that my mamma begs every wish he forms may be granted, and sure I am he will not desire a single gratification that can be deemed in the smallest degree improper." In one of my brother's letters, dated the 23rd, he hints that he shall not be permitted to see any of his relations till his trial is over, and that he therefore does not expect us. I have, however, written to Mr. Heywood, without whose approbation I would by no means take any step, for permission to go to him. If it is absolutely impossible for me to see him, though in the presence of witnesses, yet even that prohibition, cruel as it is, I could bear with patience, provided I might be near him, to see the ship in which he at present exists, to behold those objects which, perhaps at the same moment, attracts his notice, to breathe the same air which he breathes. My dearest madam, these are inestimable gratifications, and will convey sensations of rapture and delight to the fond bosom of a sister, which it is far, very far beyond my power to describe. Besides, the anxiety and impatience produced by the immense distance which now separates us from him, and the uncertainty attending the packet, render it difficult and sometimes impossible to hear of him so often as we would wish. And may I not add, though Heaven in its mercy forbid it, for alas, the bare idea is too dreadful, yet it is in the scale of possibility, that some accident might happen to deprive us of my dearest brother. How insupportably bitter would then be our reflections, for having omitted the opportunity, when it was in our power, of administering comfort and consolation to him in person. For these reasons, I earnestly hope Mr. Heywood will not judge it improper to comply with my request, and shall wait with eager impatience the arrival of his next letter. Think not, my dear madam, that it is want of confidence in your care and attention which makes me solicitous to be with my beloved brother. Be assured we are all as perfectly easy in that respect as if we were on the spot, but I am convinced you will pardon the dictates of an affection which an absence of 5 years, rendered still more painful by his sufferings, has heightened almost to a degree of adoration. I shall, with your permission, take the liberty of enclosing a letter to my brother, which I leave open for perusal, and at the same time request your pardon for mentioning you to him in such terms as I am apprehensive will wound the delicacy which ever accompanies generosity like yours. But indeed, my dearest madam, I cannot, must not, suffer my beloved boy to remain in ignorance of that worth and excellence which has prompted you to become his kind protectress. I have the honour to be, with every sentiment of gratitude, etc., 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 Nessy Heywood. Among the numerous friends that interested themselves in the fate of this unhappy youth was his uncle, Colonel Holwell. The testimony he bears to his excellent character is corroborated by all who knew him while a boy at home. About a fortnight before the trial, he writes to him thus: 21st of August, 1792. My very dear Peter,
I have this day received yours of the 18th, and am happy to find by its contents that, notwithstanding your long and cruel confinement, you still preserve your health and write in good spirits. Preserve it, my dear boy, awful as the approaching period must be, even to the most innocent, but from which all who know you have not a doubt of your rising as immaculate as a newborn infant. I have known you from your cradle, and have often remarked with pleasure and surprise the many assiduous instances, far beyond your years, you have given of filial duty and paternal affection to the best of parents, and to brothers and sisters who doted on you. Your education has been the best, and from these considerations alone, without the very clear evidence of your own testimony, I would as soon believe the Archbishop of Canterbury would set fire to the city of London, as suppose you could, directly or indirectly, join in such an absurd piece of business. Truly sorry am I that my state of health will not permit me to go down to Portsmouth to give this testimony publicly before that respectable tribunal where your country's laws have justly ordained you must appear. But consider this as the touchstone, my dear boy, by which your worth must be known. 6 years in the navy myself, and 28 years a soldier, I flatter myself my judgment will not prove erroneous. That power, my dear Peter, of whose grace and mercy you seem to have so just a sense, will not now forsake you. Your dear aunt is, as must be expected in such a trying situation, but more from your present sufferings than any apprehension of what is to follow, etc. With similar testimonies and most favourable auguries from Commodore Paisley, the Reverend Dr. Scott of the Isle of Man, and others, young Heywood went to his long and anxiously expected trial, which took place on the 12th of September, and continued to the 18th of that month. Mrs. Heywood had been anxious that Erskine and Mingay should be employed as counsel, but Mr. Graham, whom Commodore Paisley had so highly recommended, gave his best assistance, as did also Mr. Const, who had been retained, for which the Commodore expresses his sorrow, as sea officers, he says, have great aversion to lawyers. Mr. Peter Heywood assigns a better reason. In a letter to his sister Mary, he says that counsel to a naval prisoner is of no effect, and as they are not allowed to speak, their eloquence is not of the least efficacy. I request, therefore, you will desire my dear mother to revoke the letter she has been so good to write, to retain Mr. Erskine and Mr. Mingay, and to forbear putting herself to so great and needless an expense, from which no good can accrue. No, no, Mary, it is not the same as a trial on shore. It would then be highly requisite, but in this case I alone must fight my own battle, and I think my telling the truth undisguised, in a plain, short, and concise manner, is as likely to be deserving the victory as the most elaborate eloquence of a Cicero upon the same subject. At this anxious moment many painfully interesting letters passed to and from the family in the Isle of Man. The last letter from his beloved Nessy, previous to the awful event, thus concludes: "May that Almighty Providence, whose tender care has hitherto preserved you, be still your powerful protector. May He instil into the hearts of your judges every sentiment of justice, generosity, and compassion. May hope, innocence, and integrity be your firm support, and liberty, glory, and honour your just reward. May all good angels guard you from even the appearance of danger, and may you at length be restored to us, the delight, the pride of your adoring friends, and the sole happiness and felicity of that fond heart which animates the bosom of my dear Peter's most faithful and truly affectionate sister, in H." End of Chapter 5, Part 3. Recording by Haley Flagg of Texas.
Chapter 6, Part 1 of the Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brett Downey. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 6, Part 1. The Court-Martial. If any person in, or belonging to the fleet shall make, or endeavour to make, any mutinous assembly, upon any pretence whatsoever, every person offending herein, and being convicted thereof, by the sentence of the court-martial shall suffer death. Naval Articles of War, Article 19. The court assembled to try the prisoners on board His Majesty's ship Duke, on the 12th September, 1792, and continued by adjournment from day to day, Sunday excepted, until the 18th of the same month. Footnote 24. Present: Vice Admiral Lord Hood, President. Captain Sir Andrew Snape Hammond, Baronet. Captain John Colpoys. Captain Sir George Montague. Captain Sir Roger Curtis. Captain John Bazley. Captain Sir Andrew Snape Douglas. Captain John Thomas Duckworth. Captain John Nicholson Inglefield. Captain John Knight. Captain Albemarle Bertie. Captain Richard Goodwin Keats. The charge is set forth that Fletcher Christian, who was mate of the Bounty, assisted by others of the inferior officers and men, armed with muskets and bayonets, had violently and forcibly taken that ship from her commander, Lieutenant Bligh, and that he, together with the master, boatswain, gunner, and carpenter, and other persons, being 19 in number, were forced into the launch and cast adrift. That Captain Edwards, in the Pandora, was directed to proceed to Otaheite, and other islands in the South Seas, and to use his best endeavours to recover the said vessel, and to bring in confinement to England the said Fletcher Christian and his associates, or as many of them as he might be able to apprehend, in order that they might be brought to condign punishment, etc. That Peter Heywood, James Morrison, Charles Norman, Joseph Coleman, Thomas Ellison, Thomas M'Intosh, Thomas Burkitt, John Millward, William Muspratt, and Michael Byrne, had been brought to England, etc., and were now put on their trial. Mr. Fryer, the master of the Bounty, being first sworn, deposed: That he had the first watch; that between 10 and 11 o'clock Mr. Bligh came on deck, according to custom, and after a short conversation, and having given his orders for the night, left the deck; that at 12 he was relieved by the gunner, and retired, leaving all quiet; that at dawn of day he was greatly alarmed by an unusual noise; and that, on attempting to jump up, John Sumner and Matthew Quintal laid their hands upon his breast and desired him to lie still, saying he was their prisoner; that on expostulating with them he was told, 'Hold your tongue, or you are a dead man; but if you remain quiet there is none aboard will hurt a hair of your head.' He further deposes, that on raising himself on the locker, he saw on the ladder, going upon deck, Mr. Bligh in his shirt, with his hands tied behind him, and Christian holding him by the cord; that the master at arms, Churchill, then came to his cabin, and took a brace of pistols and a hanger, saying, 'I will take care of these, Mr. Fryer;' that he asked, on seeing Mr. Bligh bound, what they were going to do with the captain; that Sumner replied, 'Damn his eyes! Put him into the boat, and let him see if he can live upon 3/4 of a pound of yams a day;' that he remonstrated with such conduct, but in vain. They said he must go in the small cutter. 'The small cutter!' Mr. Fryer exclaimed; 'why her bottom is almost out, and very much eaten by the worms;' to which Sumner and Quintal both said, 'Damn his eyes! the boat is too good for him;' that after much entreaty he prevailed upon them to ask Christian if he might be allowed to go on deck, which, after some hesitation, was granted. 'When I came on deck,' says Mr. Fryer, 'Mr. Bligh was standing by the mizzen mast, with his hands tied behind him, and Christian holding the cord with one hand, and a bayonet in the other. I said, "Christian, consider what you are about." "Hold your tongue, sir," he said. "I have been in hell for weeks past. Captain Bligh has brought all this on himself." I told him that Mr. Bligh and he not agreeing was no reason for taking the ship. "Hold your tongue, sir," he said. I said, "Mr. Christian, you and I have been on friendly terms during the voyage, therefore give me leave to speak. Let Mr. Bligh go down to his cabin, and I make no doubt we shall all be friends again." He then repeated, "Hold your tongue, sir, it is too late," and threatening me if I said anything more. Mr. Fryer then asked him to give a better boat than the cutter. He said, "No, that boat is good enough." Bligh now said to the master, that the man behind the hen coops, Isaac Martin, was his friend, and desired him (the master) to knock Christian down, which Christian must have heard, but took no notice. That Fryer then attempted to get past Christian to speak to Martin, but he put his bayonet to his breast, saying, "Sir, if you advance an inch farther I will run you through," and ordered two armed men to take him down to his cabin. Shortly afterwards he was desired to go on deck, when Christian ordered him into the boat. He said, "I will stay with you if you will give me leave." "No, sir," he replied, "go directly into the boat." Bligh then on the gangway said, "Mr. Fryer, stay in the ship." "No, by God, sir," Christian said, "go into the boat, or I will run you through." Mr. Fryer states that during this time very bad language was used by the people towards Mr. Bligh, that with great difficulty they prevailed on Christian to suffer a few articles to be put into the boat; that after the persons were ordered into the boat, to the number of 19, such opprobrious language continued to be used, several of the men calling out, "Shoot the blank!" that Cole, the boatswain, advised they should cast off and take their chance, as the mutineers would certainly do them a mischief if they stayed much longer. Mr. Fryer then states the names of those who were under arms, and that Joseph Coleman, Thomas M'Intosh, Charles Norman, and Michael Byrne, prisoners, wished to come into the boat, declaring they had nothing to do in the business; that he did not perceive Mr. Peter Heywood on deck at the seizure of the ship. On being asked what he supposed Christian meant when he said he had been in hell for a fortnight, he said, from the frequent quarrels that they had, and the abuse he had received from Mr. Bligh, and that the day before the mutiny Mr. Bligh had challenged all the young gentlemen and people with stealing his cocoanuts. Mr. Cole, the boatswain, deposes, that he had the middle watch, was awakened out of his sleep in the morning, and heard a man calling out to the carpenter, that they had mutinied and taken the ship, that Christian had the command, and that the captain was a prisoner on the quarter deck; that he went up the hatchway, having seen Mr. Heywood and Mr. Young in the opposite berth; that coming on deck he saw the captain with his hands tied behind him, and 4 sentinels standing over him, 2 of which were Ellison and Burkitt, the prisoners; that he asked Mr. Christian what he meant to do, and was answered by his ordering him to hoist the boat out, and shook the bayonet, threatening him and damning him if he did not take care; that when he found the captain was to be sent out of the ship he again went aft with the carpenter to ask for the long boat; that they asked 3 or 4 times before he granted it; that he saw Mr. Peter Heywood, one of the prisoners, lending a hand to get the fore stayfall along, and when the boat was hooked on, spoke something to him, but what it was does not know, as Christian was threatening him at the time; that Heywood then went below, and does not remember seeing him afterwards; that after the few things were got into the boat, and most of the people in her, they were trying for the carpenter's tool chest, when Quintal said, "Damn them, if we let them have these things they will build a vessel in a month;" but when all were in the boat she was veered astern, when Coleman, Norman, and M'Intosh, prisoners, were crying at the gangway, wishing to go in the boat; and Byrne in the cutter alongside was also crying, that he advised Mr. Bligh to cast off, as he feared they would fire into the boat. The court asked if he had any reason to believe that any other of the prisoners than those named were detained contrary to their inclinations. Answer: I believe Mr. Heywood was. I thought all along he was intending to come away. He had no arms, and he assisted to get the boat out, and then went below. I heard Churchill call out, "Keep them below." The court: Do you think he meant Heywood? I have no reason to think any other. Mr. Peckover, the gunner's evidence is similar to that of Mr. Cole's, and need not be detailed. Mr. Purcell, the carpenter, corroborated, generally, the testimony of the 3 who had been examined. The court asked, "Did you see Mr. Heywood standing upon the booms?" "Yes, he was leaning the flat part of his hand on a cutlass, when I exclaimed, 'In the name of God, Peter, what do you do with that?' when he instantly dropped it, and assisted in hoisting the launch out, and handing the things into the boat, and then went down below, when I heard Churchill call to Thompson to keep them below, but could not tell whom he meant. I did not see Mr. Heywood after that." The court: In what light did you look upon Mr. Heywood at the time you say he dropped the cutlass on your speaking to him? Witness: I looked upon him as a person confused, and that he did not know he had a weapon in his hand, or his hand being on it, for it was not in his hand. I considered him to be confused by his instantly dropping it, and assisting in hoisting the boat out, which convinced me in my own mind that he had no hand in the conspiracy; that after this he went below, as I think, on his own account, in order to collect some of his things to put into the boat. The court: Do you, upon the solemn oath you have taken, believe that Mr. Heywood, by being armed with the cutlass at the time you have mentioned, by anything that you could collect from his gestures or speeches, had any intention of opposing, or joining others that might oppose, to stop the progress of the mutiny? Witness: No. The Court: In the time that Mr. Heywood was assisting you to get the things into the boat, did he, in any degree whatsoever, manifest a disposition to assist in the mutiny? Witness: No. The Court: Was he, during that time, deliberate or frightened, and in what manner did he behave himself? Witness: I had not an opportunity of observing his every action, being myself at that time engaged in getting several things into the boat, so that I cannot tell. The Court: Putting every circumstance together, declare to this court, upon the oath you have taken, how you considered his behaviour, whether as a person joined in the mutiny or as a person wishing well to Captain Bligh. Witness: I by no means considered him as a person concerned in the mutiny or conspiracy. Lieutenant Thomas Hayward, late 3rd Lieutenant of the Pandora, and formerly midshipman of the Bounty, deposes, that he had the morning watch, that at 4 o'clock Fletcher Christian relieved the watch as usual, that at 5 he ordered him, as master's mate of his watch, to look out, while he went down to lash his hammock up, that while looking at a shark astern of the ship, to his unutterable surprise, he saw Fletcher Christian, Charles Churchill, Thomas Burkitt, the prisoner, John Sumner, Matthew Quintal, William McCoy, Isaac Martin, Henry Hillbrant, and Alexander Smith, coming aft, armed with muskets and bayonets, that on going forward he asked Christian the cause of such an act, who told him to hold his tongue instantly, and leaving Isaac Martin as a sentinel on deck, he proceeded with the rest of his party below to Lieutenant Bligh's cabin. That the people on deck were Mr. John Hallett, myself, Robert Lamb, Butcher, Thomas Ellison, prisoner, at the helm, and John Mills at the conn. That he asked Mills if he knew anything of the matter, who pleaded total ignorance, and Thomas Ellison quitted the helm and armed himself with a bayonet. That the decks now became thronged with armed men. That Peter Heywood, James Morrison, 2 of the prisoners, and George Stewart were unarmed on the booms. That Fletcher Christian and his gang had not been down long before he heard the cry of murder from Lieutenant Bligh, and Churchill calling out for a rope, on which Mills, contrary to all orders and entreaties, cut the deep sea line and carried a piece of it to their assistance. That soon after Lieutenant Bligh was brought upon the quarter deck with his hands bound behind him, and was surrounded by most of those who came last on deck. This witness then states that on the arrival of the Pandora at Matavai Bay, Joseph Coleman was the first that came on board; that he was upset in a canoe and assisted by the natives; that as soon as the ship was at anchor, George Stewart and Peter Heywood came on board; that they made themselves known to Captain Edwards, and expressed their happiness that he was arrived; that he asked them how they came to go away with his Majesty's ship the Bounty, when George Stewart said, when called upon hereafter, he would answer all particulars; that he was prevented by Captain Edwards from answering further questions, and they were sent out of the cabin to be confined. He then describes the manner in which the rest of the mutineers were taken on the island, having stated that when he went below to get some things he saw Peter Heywood in his berth, and told him to go into the boat. He was asked by the court if Heywood was prevented by any force from going upon deck. He answered, No. The Court: Did you, from his behaviour, consider him as a person attached to his duty or to the party of mutineers? Witness: I should rather suppose, after my having told him to go into the boat, and he not joining us, to be on the side of the mutineers, but that must be understood only as an opinion, as he was not in the least employed during the active part of it. The Court: Did you observe any marks of joy or sorrow on his countenance or behaviour? Witness: Sorrow. Lieutenant Hallett, late midshipman of the Bounty, states that he had the morning watch, that he heard Lieutenant Bligh call out murder, and presently after saw him brought upon the deck naked, excepting his shirt, with his hands tied behind him, and Christian holding the end of the cord which tied them in one hand, and either a bayonet or a cutlass in the other; that the cutter was hoisted out, and Mr. Samuel, Mr. Hayward, and myself ordered to go into her, but the boatswain and carpenter going aft, and telling Christian they wished to go with the captain rather than stay in the ship, and asking to have the launch, it was granted. On being asked if he saw Peter Heywood on that day, he replied, once, on the platform, standing still and looking attentively towards Captain Bligh. Never saw him under arms, nor spoke to him. Does not know if he offered to go into the boat, nor did he hear any one propose to him to go into the boat. That when standing on the platform, Captain Bligh said something to him, but what he did not hear, upon which Heywood laughed, turned round, and walked away. Captain Edwards, being then called and sworn, was desired by the court to state the conversation that passed between him and Coleman, Peter Heywood, and George Stewart when they came on board the Pandora. Edwards: Joseph Coleman attempted to come on board before the ship came to an anchor at Otaheite. He was soon afterwards taken up by canoes, and came on board before the ship came to an anchor. I began to make inquiries of him after the Bounty and her people. The next who came on board were Stewart and Peter Heywood. They came after the ship was at anchor, but before any boat was on shore. I did not see them come alongside. I desired Lieutenant Larkin to bring them down to the cabin. I asked them what news. Peter Heywood, I think, said he supposed I had heard of the affair of the Bounty. I don't recollect all the conversation that passed between us. He sometimes interrupted me by asking for Mr. Hayward, the lieutenant of the Pandora, whether he was on board or not. He had heard that he was. At last I acknowledged that he was, and I desired him to come out of my stateroom, where I had desired him to go into, as he happened to be with me at the time. Lieutenant Hayward treated him with a sort of contemptuous look, and began to enter into conversation with him respecting the Bounty. But I called the sentinel in, to take them into custody, and ordered Lieutenant Hayward to desist, and I ordered them to be put into irons. Some words passed, and Peter Heywood said he should be able to vindicate his conduct. Lieutenant Corner, of the Pandora, merely states his being sent to bring the rest of the mutineers on board, who were at some distance from Matavai Bay. The prisoners being called on for their defence, the witnesses were again separately called, and examined on the part of the prisoners. Mr. Fryer, the master, called in and examined by Mr. Heywood. If you had been permitted, would you have stayed in the ship in preference to going into the boat? Witness: Yes. Prisoner: Had you stayed in the ship in expectation of retaking her, was my conduct such, from the first moment you knew me to this, as would have induced you to entrust me with your design, and do you believe I would have favoured it, and given you all the assistance in my power? Witness: I believe he would. I should not have hesitated a moment in asking of him when I had an opportunity of opening my mind to him. Same question being put to Mr. Cole, the boatswain, Mr. Peckover, the gunner, and Mr. Purcell, the carpenter, they all answered in the affirmative. Mr. Heywood asked, what was my general conduct, temper, and disposition on board the ship? Witness: Beloved by everybody, to the best of my recollection. To the same question Mr. Cole answers, always a very good character. Mr. Peckover: the most amiable and deserving of everyone's esteem. Mr. Purcell: in every respect becoming the character of a gentleman, and such as merited the esteem of everybody. Mr. Cole, being examined, gave his testimony, that he never saw Mr. Heywood armed, that he did not consider him of the mutineers' party, that he saw nothing of levity or apparent merriment in his conduct, that when he was below with Stewart he heard Churchill call out, "Keep them below," and that he believes Heywood was one of the persons meant, has no doubt of it at all, that Bligh could not have spoken to him, when on the booms, loud enough to be heard, that Heywood was alarmed, and Hallet alarmed, that he by no means considers Heywood or Morrison as mutineers. Mr. Purcell, being examined, states, that respecting the cutlass on which he saw Mr. Heywood's hand resting, he does not consider him as being an armed man, that he never thought of him as of the mutineers' party, that he never heard Captain Bligh speak to him, that he thinks from his situation he could not have heard him, that he was by no means guilty of levity or apparent merriment, that he heard the master-at-arms call out to keep them below, that Mr. Hallet appeared to him to be very much confused, and that Mr. Hayward likewise appeared to be very much confused. The court asked, as you say you did not look upon the prisoner as a person armed, to what did you allude when you exclaimed, "Good God, Peter, what do you do with that?" Witness: I look upon it as an accidental thing. Captain Edwards being asked by Heywood, "Did I surrender myself to you upon the arrival of the Pandora at Otaheite?" Witness: "Not to me, to the lieutenant. I apprehend he put himself in my power. I always understood he came voluntarily. Our boats were not in the water." Prisoner: "Did I give you such information respecting myself and the Bounty as afterwards proved true?" Witness: "He gave me some information respecting the people on the island, that corroborated with Coleman's. I do not recollect the particular conversation, but in general it agreed with the account given by Coleman." Prisoner: "When I told you that I went away the first time from Otaheite with the pirates, did I not at the same time inform you that it was not possible for me to separate myself from Christian, who would not permit any man of the party to leave him at that time, lest, by giving intelligence, they might have been discovered whenever a ship should arrive?" Witness: "Yes, but I do not recollect the latter part of it, respecting giving intelligence." Mr. Fryer again called in and examined by Mr. Morrison. Mr. Fryer states he saw him assist in hoisting out the boats; that he said to him, Fryer, "Go down below." The court asked whether it might not have been from a laudable motive, as supposing your assistance at that time might have prevented a more advantageous effort. Witness: "Probably it might. Had I stayed in the ship, he would have been one of the first that I should have opened my mind to, from his good behaviour in the former part of the voyage. States his belief that he addressed him as advice, and that, in hoisting out the boat, he was assisting Captain Bligh. Mr. Cole, the boatswain, states that he ordered Morrison to go and help them with the cutter; that he told them the boat was overloaded; that Captain Bligh had begged that no more people should go in her, and said he would take his chance in the ship; that he shook Morrison by the hand, and said he would do him justice in England; that he had no reason to suppose him concerned in the mutiny. Lieutenant Thomas Hayward states that Morrison appeared joyful, and supposed him to be one of the mutineers. On being asked by Morrison if he could declare before God and the court that what he stated was not the result of private pique? Witness: "Not the result of any private pique, but an opinion formed after quitting the ship. From his not coming with us, there being more boats than one, cannot say they might have had the cutter." This witness was pleased to remember nothing that was in favour of the prisoner. Lieutenant Hallett states he saw Morrison under arms. Being asked in what part of the ship, he says, "I did not see him under arms till the boat was veered astern, and he was then looking over the taffrail, and called out, in a jeering manner, 'If my friends inquire after me, tell them I am somewhere in the South Seas.'" Captain Edwards bore testimony that Morrison voluntarily surrendered himself. Mr. Fryer did not see Morrison armed. He was in his watch, and he considered him a steady, sober, attentive, good man, and acknowledged that if he had remained in the ship, with the view of retaking her, Morrison would have been one of the first he should have called to his assistance. Mr. Cole gave testimony to his being a man of good character, attentive to his duty, and he never knew any harm of him. Mr. Purcell bore witness to his good character, being always diligent and attentive. Did not see him under arms on the taffrail, never heard him use any jeering speeches. Respecting the prisoner Muspratt, Mr. Cole's evidence proves that he had a musket in his hands, but not till the latter part of the business. It is also proved that he assisted in getting things into the launch. Mr. Peckover saw him standing on the forecastle doing nothing. He was not armed. Lieutenant Hayward saw Muspratt among the armed men. Was asked when Captain Bligh used the words, "Don't let the boat be overloaded, my lads, I'll do you justice." Do you understand the latter words, "My lads, I'll do you justice," to apply to clothes or to the men, whom he apprehended might go into the boat? Witness: If Captain Bligh made use of the words "my lads," it was to the people already in the boat, and not to those in the ship. The Court: To whom do you imagine Captain Bligh alluded? Was it, in your opinion, to the men in the boat with him, or to any persons then remaining in the ship? Witness: To persons remaining in the ship. End of Chapter 6, Part 1. Recording by Brett Downey. Chapter 6, Part 2 of the eventful history of the mutiny and piratical seizure of HMS Bounty, its cause and consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brett Downey. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 6, Part 2. Against the prisoners Ellison, Burkitt, and Millward, the evidence given by all the witnesses so clearly and distinctly proved they were under arms the whole time, and actively employed against Bligh, that it is unnecessary to go into any detail as far as they are concerned. The court having called on the prisoners each separately for his defence, Mr. Hayward delivered his as follows: My lords and gentlemen of this honourable court, your attention has already been sufficiently exercised in the painful narrative of this trial. It is therefore my duty to trespass further on it as little as possible. The crime of mutiny, for which I am now arraigned, is so seriously pregnant with every danger and mischief, that it makes the person so accused, in the eyes, not only of military men of every description, but of every nation, appear at once the object of unpardonable guilt and exemplary vengeance. In such a character it is my misfortune to appear before this tribunal, and no doubt I must have been gazed at with all that horror and indignation which the conspirators of such a mutiny as that in Captain Bligh's ship so immediately provoke. Hard, then, indeed is my fate, that circumstances should so occur to point me out as one of them. Appearances, probably, are against me, but they are appearances only, for unless I may be deemed guilty for feeling a repugnance at embracing death unnecessarily, I declare before this court and the tribunal of Almighty God I am innocent of the charge. I chose rather to defer asking any questions of the witnesses until I heard the whole of the evidence, as the charge itself, although I knew it generally, was not in its full extent, nor in particular points, made known to me before I heard it read by the judge advocate at the beginning of the trial. And I feel myself relieved by having adopted such a mode, as it enables me to set right a few particulars of a narrative which I had the honour to transmit to the Earl of Chatham, containing an account of all that passed on the fatal morning of the 28th of April 1789, but which, from the confusion the ship was in during the mutiny, I might have mistaken, or from the errors of an imperfect recollection, I might have misstated. The difference, however, will now be open to correction, and I have great satisfaction in observing that the mistakes but very slightly respect my part of the transaction, and I shall consequently escape the imputation of endeavouring to save myself by imposing on my judges. When first this sad event took place I was sleeping in my hammock, nor, till the very moment of being awakened from it, had I the least intimation of what was going on. The spectacle was as sudden to my eyes as it was unknown to my heart, and both were convulsed at the scene. Matthew Thompson was the first that claimed my attention upon waking. He was sitting as a sentinel over the arm chest and my berth, and informed me that the captain was a prisoner, and Christian had taken the command of the ship. I entreated for permission to go upon deck, and soon after the boatswain and the carpenter had seen me in my berth, as they were going up from the fore hatchway. I followed them, as is stated in their evidence. It is not in my power to describe my feelings upon seeing the captain as I did, who, with his hands tied behind him, was standing on the quarterdeck, a little abaft the mizzen mast, and Christian by his side. My faculties were benumbed, and I did not recover the power of recollection until called to by somebody to take hold of the tackle fall, and assist to get out the launch, which I found was to be given to the captain instead of the large cutter, already in the water alongside the ship. It were in vain to say what things I put into the boat, but many were handed in by me, and in doing this it was that my hand touched the cutlass, for I will not attempt to deny what the carpenter has deposed, though, on my conscience, I am persuaded it was of momentary duration, and innocent as to intention. The former is evident from its being unobserved by every witness who saw me upon deck, some of whom must have noticed it had it continued a single minute, and the latter is proved by the only person who took notice of the circumstance, and has also deposed that, at the moment he beheld me, I was apparently in a state of absolute stupor. The poison, therefore, carries with it its antidote, and it seems needless to make any further comment on the subject, for no man can be weak enough to suppose, that if I had been armed for the purpose of assisting in the mutiny, I should have resumed a weapon in the moment of triumph and when the ship was so completely in the possession of the party, that, as more than one witness has emphatically expressed it, all attempts at recovering her would have been impracticable. The boat and ship, it is true, presented themselves to me without its once occurring that I was at liberty to choose, much less that the choice I should make would be afterwards deemed criminal, and I bitterly deplore that my extreme youth and inexperience concurred in torturing me with apprehensions, and prevented me from preferring the former, for as things have turned out, it would have saved me from the disgrace of appearing before you as I do at this day. It would have spared the sharp conflicts of my own mind ever since, and the agonizing tears of a tender mother and my much beloved sisters. Add to my youth and inexperience, that I was influenced in my conduct by the example of my messmates, Mr. Hallett and Mr. Hayward, the former of whom was very much agitated, and the latter, though he had been many years at sea, yet, when Christian ordered him into the boat, he was evidently alarmed at the perilous situation, and so much overcome by the harsh command that he actually shed tears. My own apprehensions were far from being lessened at such a circumstance as this, and I fearfully beheld the preparations for the captain's departure as the preliminaries of inevitable destruction, which, although I did not think could be more certain, yet I feared would be more speedy by the least addition to their number. To show that I have no disposition to impose upon this court, by endeavouring to paint the situation of the boat to be worse than it really was, I need only refer to the captain's own narrative, wherein he says that she would have sunk with them on the evening of the 3rd May, had it not been for his timely caution of throwing out some of the stores, and all the clothes belonging to the people, excepting 2 suits for each. Now what clothes or stores could they have spared which in weight would have been equal to that of 2 men? For if I had been in her, and the poor fellow Norton had not been murdered at Tafua, she would have been encumbered with our additional weight; and if it be true that she was saved by those means, which the captain says she was, it must follow that if Norton and myself had been in her, to say nothing of Coleman, M'Intosh, Norman, and Byrne, who, 'tis confessed, were desirous of leaving the ship, she must either have gone down with us, or, to prevent it, we must have lightened her of the provisions and other necessary articles, and thereby have perished for want. Dreadful alternative! A choice of deaths, to those who are certain of dying, may be a matter of indifference, but where, on one hand, death appears inevitable, and the means of salvation present themselves on the other, however imprudent it might be to resort to those means in any other less trying situation, I think, and hope even at my present time of life, that I shall not be suspected of a want of courage for saying few men would hesitate to embrace the latter. Such then was exactly my situation on board the Bounty. To be starved to death, or drowned, appeared to be inevitable if I went in the boat, and surely it is not to be wondered at, if, at the age of 16 years, with no one to advise with, and so ignorant of the discipline of the service, having never been at sea before, as not to know or even suppose it was possible that what I should determine upon might afterwards be alleged against me as a crime. I say, under such circumstances, in so trying a situation, can it be wondered at, if I suffered the preservation of my life to be the first, and to supersede every other, consideration? Besides, through the medium of the master, the captain had directed the rest of the officers to remain on board, in hopes of retaking the ship. Such is the master's assertion, and such the report on board, and as it accorded with my own wishes for the preservation of my life, I felt myself doubly justified in staying on board, not only as it appeared to be safer than going in the boat, but from a consideration also of being in the way to be useful in assisting to accomplish so desirable a wish of the captain. Let it not, for God's sake, let it not be argued that my fears were groundless, and that the arrival of the boat at Timor is a proof that my conduct was wrong. This would be judging from the event, and I think I have plainly shown that, but for the death of Norton at Tofoa, and the prudent order of the captain not to overload the boat, neither himself nor any of the people who were saved with him would at this moment have been alive to have preferred any charge against me, or given evidence at this trial. If deliberate guilt be necessarily affixed to all who continued on board the ship, and that in consequence they must be numbered with Christian's party, In such a strict view of matters it must irrevocably impeach the armourer and 2 carpenter's mates, as well as Martin and Byrne, who certainly wished to quit the ship; and if Christian's first intention of sending away the captain, with a few persons only, in the small cutter, had not been given up, or if even the large cutter had not been exchanged for the launch, more than half of those who did go with him would have been obliged to stay with me. Forgetful for a moment of my own misfortunes, I cannot help being agitated at the bare thought of their narrow escape. Everybody must, and I am sure that this court will, allow that my case is a peculiarly hard one, inasmuch as the running away with the ship is a proof of the mutiny having been committed. The innocent and the guilty are upon exactly the same footing. Had the former been confined by sickness, without a leg to stand on, or an arm to assist them in opposing the mutineers, they must have been put upon their trial, and instead of the captain being obliged to prove their guilt, it would have been incumbent upon them to have proved themselves innocent. How can this be done but negatively? If all who wished it could not accompany the captain, they were necessarily compelled to stay with Christian, and being with him, were dependent on him, subject to his orders, however disinclined to obey them, for force in such a state is paramount to everything. But when, on the contrary, instead of being in arms, or obeying any orders of the mutineers, I did everything in my power to assist the captain, and those who went with him, and by all my actions, except in neglecting to do what, if I had done, must have endangered the lives of those who were so fortunate as to quit the ship, I showed myself faithful to the last moment of the captain's stay. What is there to leave a doubt in the minds of impartial and dispassionate men of my being perfectly innocent? Happy indeed should I have been if the master had stayed on board, which he probably would have done, if his reasons for wishing to do so had not been overheard by the man who was in the bread room. Captain Bligh, in his narrative, acknowledges that he left some friends on board the Bounty, and no part of my conduct could have induced him to believe that I ought not to be reckoned of the number. Indeed, from his attention to, and very kind treatment of me personally, I should have been a monster of depravity to have betrayed him. The idea alone is sufficient to disturb a mind where humanity and gratitude have, I hope, ever been noticed as its characteristic features. And yet Mr. Hallett has said that he saw me laugh at a time when, heaven knows, the conflict in my own mind, independent of the captain's situation, rendered such a want of decency impossible. The charge in its nature is dreadful, but I boldly declare, notwithstanding an internal conviction of my innocence has enabled me to endure my sufferings for the last 16 months, could I have laid to my heart so heavy an accusation, I should not have lived to defend myself from it. And this brings to my recollection another part of Captain Bligh's narrative, in which he says, "I was kept apart from everyone, and all I could do was by speaking to them in general. But my endeavours were of no avail, for I was kept securely bound, and no one but the guard was suffered to come near me." If the captain, whose narrative we may suppose to have been a detail of everything which happened, could only recollect that he had spoken generally to the people, I trust it will hardly be believed that Mr. Hallett, without notes, at so distant a period as this, should be capable of recollecting that he heard him speak to any one in particular; and here it may not be improper to observe that, at the time to which I allude, Mr. Hallett, if I am rightly informed, could not have been more than 15 years of age. I mean not to impeach his courage, but I think if circumstances be considered, and an adequate idea of the confused state of the ship can be formed by this court, it will not appear probable that this young gentleman should have been so perfectly unembarrassed as to have been able to particularize the muscles of a man's countenance, even at a considerable distance from him; and what is still more extraordinary is, that he heard the captain call to me from abaft the mizzen to the platform where I was standing, which required an exertion of voice, and must have been heard and noticed by all who were present, as the captain and Christian were at that awful moment the objects of every one's peculiar attention. Yet he who was standing between us, and noticing the transactions of us both, could not hear what was said. To me it has ever occurred that diffidence is very becoming, and of all human attainments a knowledge of ourselves is the most difficult; and if, in the ordinary course of life, it is not an easy matter precisely to account for our own actions, how much more difficult and hazardous must it be, in new and momentous scenes, when the mind is hurried and distressed by conflicting passions, to judge of another's conduct, and yet here are two young men, who, after a lapse of near 4 years, in which period one of them, like myself, has grown from a boy to be a man, without hesitation, in a matter on which my life is depending, undertake to account for some of my actions, at a time, too, when some of the most experienced officers in the ship are not ashamed to acknowledge they were overcome by the confusion which the mutiny occasioned, and are incapable of recollecting a number of their own transactions on that day. I can only oppose to such open boldness the calm suggestions of reason, and would willingly be persuaded that the impression under which this evidence has been given is not in any degree open to suspicion. I would be understood, at the same time, not to mean anything injurious to the character of Mr. Hallet, and for Mr. Hayward, I ever loved him, and must do him the justice to declare, that whatever cause I may have to deplore the effect of his evidence, or rather his opinion, for he has deposed no fact against me, yet I am convinced it was given conscientiously, and with a tenderness and feeling becoming a man of honour. But may they not both be mistaken? Let it be remembered that their long intimacy with Captain Bligh, in whose distresses they were partakers, and whose sufferings were severely felt by them, naturally begot an abhorrence towards those whom they thought the authors of their misery. Might they not forget that the story had been told to them, and by first of all believing, then constantly thinking of it, be persuaded at last it was a fact within the compass of their own knowledge? It is the more natural to believe it so, from Mr. Hallet's forgetting what the captain said upon the occasion, which, had he been so collected as he pretends to have been, he certainly must have heard. Mr. Hayward, also, it is evident, has made a mistake in point of time as to the seeing me with Morrison and Millward upon the booms, for the boatswain and the carpenter in their evidence have said, and the concurring testimony of every one supports the fact, that the mutiny had taken place and the captain was on deck before they came up, and it was not till after that time that the boatswain called Morrison and Millward out of their hammocks. Therefore to have seen me at all upon the booms with those two men, it must have been long after the time that Mr. Hayward has said it was. Again, Mr. Hayward has said that he could not recollect the day nor even the month when the Pandora arrived at Otaheite. Neither did Captain Edwards recollect when, on his return, he wrote to the Admiralty, that Michael Byrne had surrendered himself as one of the Bounty's people. But in that letter he reported him as having been apprehended, which plainly shows that the memory is fallible to a very great degree, and it is a fair conclusion to draw that, when the mind is at rest, which must have been the case with Mr. Hayward in the Pandora, and the things of a few months' date are difficult to be remembered, it is next to impossible, in the state which everybody was on board the Bounty, to remember their particular actions at the distance of 3 years and a half after they were observed. As to the advice he says he gave me to go into the boat, I can only say, I have a faint recollection of a short conversation with somebody. I thought it was Mr. Stewart, but be that as it may, I think I may take upon me to say it was on deck and not below, for on hearing it suggested that I should be deemed guilty if I stayed in the ship, I went down directly, and in passing Mr. Cole, told him, in a low tone of voice, that I would fetch a few necessaries in a bag and follow him into the boat, which at that time I meant to do, but was afterwards prevented. Surely I shall not be deemed criminal that I hesitated at getting into a boat whose gunwale, when she left the ship, was not quite 8 inches above the surface of the water, and if, in the moment of unexpected trial, fear and confusion assailed my untaught judgment, and that by remaining in the ship I appeared to deny my commander, it was in appearance only. It was the sin of my head, for I solemnly assure you before God that it was not the vileness of my heart. I was surprised into my error by a mixture of ignorance, apprehension, and the prevalence of example, and, alarmed as I was for my sleep, there was little opportunity and less time for better recollection. The captain, I am persuaded, did not see me during the mutiny, for I retired, as it were, in sorrowful suspense, alternately agitated between hope and fear, not knowing what to do. The dread of being asked by him, or of being ordered by Christian to go into the boat, or, which appeared to me worse than either, of being desired by the latter to join his party, induced me to keep out of the sight of both until I was a second time confined in my berth by Thompson, when the determination I had made was too late to be useful. One instance of my conduct I had nearly forgot, which, with much anxiety and great astonishment, I have heard observed upon and considered as a fault, though I had imagined it blameless, if not laudable. I mean the assistance I gave in hoisting out the launch, which, by a mode of expression of the boatswain's, who says I did it voluntarily, meaning that I did not refuse my assistance when he asked me to give it, the court, I am afraid, has considered it as giving assistance to the mutineers, and not done with a view to help the captain, of which, however, I have no doubt of being able to give a satisfactory explanation in evidence. Observations on matters of opinion I will endeavour to forbear where they appear to have been formed from the impulse of the moment, but I shall be pardoned for remembering Mr. Hayward's, given I will allow with great deliberation, and after long weighing the question which called for it, which cannot be reckoned of that description; for although he says he rather considered me as a friend to Christian's party, he states that his last words to me were, 'Peter, go into the boat,' which words could not have been addressed to one who was of the party of the mutineers; and I am sure, if the countenance is at all an index to the heart, mine must have betrayed the sorrow and distress he has so accurately described. It were trespassing unnecessarily upon the patience of the court, to be giving a tedious history of what happened in consequence of the mutiny, and how, through one very imprudent step, I was unavoidably led into others; but, amidst all this pilgrimage of distress, I had a conscience, thank heaven, which lulled away the pain of personal difficulties, dangers, and distress. It was this conscious principle which determined me not to hide myself as if guilty. No, I welcomed the arrival of the Pandora at Otaheite, and embraced the earliest opportunity of freely surrendering myself to the captain of that ship. By his order I was chained and punished with incredible severity, though the ship was threatened with instant destruction, when fear and trembling came on every man on board. In vain, for a long time, were my earnest, repeated cries, that the galling irons might not, in that moment of a frightening consternation, prevent my hands from being lifted up to heaven for mercy. But though it cannot fail deeply to interest the humanity of this court, and kindle in the breast of every member of it compassion for my sufferings, yet as it is not relative to the point, and as I cannot for a moment believe that it proceeded from any improper motive on the part of Captain Edwards, whose character in the navy stands high in estimation both as an officer and a man of humanity, but rather that he was actuated in his conduct towards me by the imperious dictates of the laws of the service, I shall, therefore, waive it, and say no more upon the subject. Believe me, again I entreat you will believe me, when, in the name of the tremendous Judge of heaven and earth, before whose vindictive majesty I may be destined soon to appear, I now assert my innocence of plotting, abetting, or assisting, either by word or deed, the mutiny for which I am tried; for, young as I am still younger in the school of art and such matured infamy. My parents (but I have only one left, a solitary and mournful mother, who is at home weeping and trembling for the event of this day), thanks to their fostering care, taught me betimes to reverence God, to honour the king, and be obedient to his laws, and at no one time have I resolutely or designedly been an apostate to either. To this honourable court, then, I now commit myself. My character and my life are at your disposal, and as the former is as sacred to me as the latter is precious, the consolation or settled misery of a dear mother and two sisters, who mingle their tears together, and are all but frantic for my situation, pause for your verdict. If I am found worthy of life, it shall be improved by past experience, and especially taught from the serious lesson of what has lately happened. But if nothing but death itself can atone for my pitiable indiscretion, I bow with submission, and all due respect to your impartial decision. Not with sullen indifference shall I then meditate on my doom as not deserving it. No, such behaviour would be an insult to God and an affront to man, and the attentive and candid deportment of my judges in this place requires more becoming manners in me. Yet if I am found guilty this day they will not construe it, I trust, as the least disrespect offered to their discernment and opinion, if I solemnly declare that my heart will rely with confidence on its own innocence, until that awful period when my spirit shall be about to be separated from my body to take its everlasting flight. and be ushered into the presence of that unerring judge, before whom all hearts are open and from whom no secrets are hid. P. Heywood. His witnesses fully established the facts which he assumed in this defence. He then delivered to the president a paper, of which the following is a copy. My lord, the court having heard the witnesses I have been enabled to call, it will be unnecessary to add anything to their testimony in point of fact, or to observe upon it by way of illustration. It is, I trust, sufficient to do away any suspicion which may have fallen upon me, and to remove every implication of guilt which, while unexplained, might by possibility have attached to me. It is true I have, by the absence of Captain Bligh, Simpson, and Tinkler, been deprived of the opportunity of laying before the court much that would at least have been grateful to my feelings, though I hope not necessary to my defence, as the former must have exculpated me from the least disrespect, and the two last would have proved past all contradiction that I was unjustly accused. I might regret that in their absence I have been arraigned, but, thank heaven, I have been enabled, by the very witnesses who were called to criminate me, to oppose facts to opinions, and give explanation to circumstances of suspicion. It has been proved that I was asleep at the time of the mutiny, and waked only to confusion and dismay. It has been proved, it is true, that I continued on board the ship, but it has been also proved I was detained by force, and to this I must add, I left the society of those with whom I was for a time obliged to associate, as soon as possible, and with unbounded satisfaction resigned myself to the captain of the Pandora, to whom I gave myself up, to whom I also delivered my journal, footnote 25, faithfully brought up to the preceding day, and to whom I also gave every information in my power. I could do no more, for at the first time we were at Otaheite it was impossible for me, watched and suspected as I was, to separate from the ship. My information to Captain Edwards was open, sincere, and unqualified, and I had many opportunities given me at different times of repeating it. Had a track been open to my native country, I should have followed it. Had a vessel arrived earlier, I should earlier, with the same eagerness, have embraced the opportunity, for I dreaded not an inquiry in which I foresaw no discredit. But Providence ordained it otherwise. I had been the victim of suspicion, and had nearly fallen a sacrifice to misapprehension. I have, however, hitherto surmounted it, and it only remains with this court to say if my sufferings have not been equal to my indiscretion. The decision will be the voice of honour, and to that I must implicitly resign myself. P. Heywood. Mr. Morrison's defence sets out by stating that he was waked at daylight by Mr. Cole the boatswain, who told him that the ship was taken by Christian, that he assisted in clearing out the boat at Mr. Cole's desire, and says, while I was thus employed, Mr. Fryer came to me, and asked if I had any hand in the mutiny. I told him no. He then desired me to see who I could find to assist me, and try to rescue the ship. I told him I feared it was then too late, but would do my endeavour, when John Millward, who stood by me, and heard what Mr. Fryer said, swore he would stand by me if an opportunity offered. Mr. Fryer was about to speak again, but was prevented by Matthew Quintal, who, with a pistol in one hand, collared him with the other, saying, "Come, Mr. Fryer, you must go down into your cabin," and hauled him away. Churchill then came, and shaking his cutlass at me, demanded what Mr. Fryer said. I told him he only asked me if they were going to have the longboat, upon which Alexander Smith (Adams), who stood on the opposite side of the boat, said, "It's a damned lie, Charlie, for I saw him and Millward shake hands when the master spoke to them." Churchill then said to me, "I would have you mind how you come on, for I have an eye upon you." Smith at the same time called out, "Stand to your arms, for they intend to make a rush." This, as it was intended, put the mutineers on their guard, and I found it necessary to be very cautious how I acted. And I heard Captain Bligh say to Smith, "I did not expect you would be against me, Smith," but I could not hear what answer he made. He says that, while clearing the boat, he heard Christian order Churchill to see that no arms were put into her, to keep Norman, Mackintosh, and Coleman in the ship, and get the officers into the boat as fast as possible. That Mr. Fryer begged permission to stay, but to no purpose. On seeing Mr. Fryer and most of the officers going into the boat, without the least appearance of an effort to rescue the ship, I began to reflect on my own situation, and seeing the situation of the boat, and considering that she was at least 1,000 leagues from any friendly settlement, and judging, from what I had seen of the Friendly Islanders but a few days before, that nothing could be expected from them but to be plundered or killed, and seeing no choice but of one evil, I chose, as I thought the least, to stay in the ship, especially as I considered it as obeying Captain Bligh's orders, and depending on his promise to do justice to those who remained. I informed Mr. Cole of my intention, who made me the like promise, taking me by the hand and saying, 'God bless you, my boy, I will do you justice if ever I reach England.' I also informed Mr. Hayward of my intention, and on his dropping a hint to me that he intended to knock Churchill down, I told him I would second him, pointing to some of the Friendly Island clubs which were sticking in the booms, and saying, 'There were tools enough.' But," he adds, "I was suddenly damped to find that he went into the boat without making the attempt he had proposed." He then appeals to the members of the court, as to the alternative they would themselves have taken. A boat alongside, already crowded, those who were in her crying out she would sink, and Captain Bligh desiring no more might go in, with a slender stock of provisions. What hope could there be to reach any friendly shore, or withstand the hostile attack of the boisterous elements? The perils those underwent who reached the island of Timor, and whom nothing but the apparent interference of divine providence could have saved, fully justify my fears, and prove beyond a doubt that they rested on a solid foundation; for by staying in the ship, an opportunity might offer of escaping, but by going in the boat nothing but death appeared, either from the lingering torments of hunger and thirst, or from the murderous weapons of cruel savages, or being swallowed up by the deep. I have endeavoured," he says, "to recall to Mr. Hayward's remembrance a proposal he at one time made, by words, of attacking the mutineers, and of my encouraging him to the attempt, promising to back him. He says he has but a faint recollection of the business, so faint indeed that he cannot recall to his memory the particulars, but owns there was something passed to that effect. Faint, however, as his remembrance is, which for me is the more unfortunate, ought it not to do away all doubt with respect to the motives by which I was then influenced? And in conclusion he says, 'I beg leave most humbly to remind the members of this honourable court that I did freely, and of my own accord, deliver myself up to Lieutenant Robert Corner of HMS Pandora on the first certain notice of her arrival.' William Muspratt's defence. Declares his innocence of any participation in the mutiny. Admits he assisted in hoisting out the boat, and in putting several articles into her, after which he sat down on the booms, when Millward came and mentioned to him Mr. Fryer's intention to rescue the ship, when he said he would stand by Mr. Fryer as far as he could, and with that intention, and for that purpose only, he took up a musket which one of the people had laid down, and which he quitted the moment he saw Bligh's people get into the boat. Solemnly denies the charge of Mr. Purcell against him of handing liquor to the ship's company. Mr. Hayward's evidence, he trusts, must stand so impeached before the court as not to receive the least attention, when the lives of so many men are to be affected by it; for, he observes, he swears that Morrison was a mutineer, because he assisted in hoisting out the boats, and that M'Intosh was not a mutineer, notwithstanding he was precisely employed on the same business; that he criminated Morrison from the appearance of his countenance; that he had only a faint remembrance of that material and striking circumstance of Morrison's offering to join him to retake the ship; that in answer to Muspratt's question respecting Captain Bligh's words, 'My lads, I'll do you justice,' he considered them applied to the people in the boat, and not to those in the ship; to the same question put by the court, he said they applied to persons remaining in the ship; and he notices some other instances which he thinks most materially affect Mr. Hayward's credit, and says, that if he had been under arms when Hayward swore he was, he humbly submits Mr. Hallett must have seen him; and he concludes with asserting, what indeed was a very general opinion, that the great misfortune attending this unhappy business is, that no one ever attempted to rescue the ship; that it might have been done, Thompson being the only sentinel over the arm chest. Michael Burns' defence was very short. He says, 'It has pleased the Almighty, among the events of his unsearchable providence, nearly to deprive me of sight, which often puts it out of my power to carry the intentions of my mind into execution. I make no doubt but it appears to this honourable court that on the 28th of April, 1789, my intention was to quit his Majesty's ship Bounty with the officers and men who went away, and that the sorrow I expressed at being detained was real and unfeigned. I do not know whether I may be able to repeat the exact words that were spoken on the occasion, but some said, 'We must not part with our fiddler,' and Charles Churchill threatened to send me to the Shades if I attempted to quit the cutter, into which I had gone for the purpose of attending Lieutenant Bligh; and, without further trespassing on the time of the court, he submits his case to its judgment and mercy. It is not necessary to notice any parts of the defence made by Coleman, Norman, and Mackintosh, as it is clear, from the whole evidence and from Bligh's certificates, that those men were anxious to go in the boat, but were kept in the ship by force. It is equally clear that Ellison, Millward, and Burkitt were concerned in every stage of the mutiny, and had little to offer in their defence in exculpation of the crime of which they were accused. On the sixth day, namely, on the 18th of September, 1792, the court met. The prisoners were brought in, audience admitted, when the President, having asked the prisoners if they or any of them had anything more to offer in their defence, the court was cleared, and agreed, that the charges had been proved against the said Peter Heywood, James Morrison, Thomas Ellison, Thomas Burkitt, John Millward, and William Muspratt, and did adjudge them, and each of them, to suffer death, by being hanged by the neck, on board such of his Majesty's ship or ships of war, and at such time or times, and at such place or places, as the commissioners for executing the office of Lord High Admiral of Great Britain and Ireland, etc., or any three of them, for the time being, should, in writing, under their hands direct. But the court, in consideration of various circumstances, did humbly and most earnestly recommend the said Peter Heywood and James Morrison to his Majesty's mercy, and the court further agreed that the charges had not been proved against the said Charles Norman, Joseph Coleman, Thomas Mackintosh, and Michael Byrne, and did adjudge them and each of them to be acquitted. The court was then opened and audience admitted, and sentence passed accordingly. End of Chapter 6, Part 2. Recording by Brett Downey.
Chapter 7, Part 1 of the Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 7, Part 1. The King's Warrant. Well, believe this, no ceremony that to great ones longs, not the king's crown, nor the deputed sword, the marshal's truncheon, nor the judge's robe, become them with one half so good a grace as mercy does. It was a very common feeling that Heywood and Morrison, the former in particular, had been hardly dealt with by the court in passing upon them a sentence of death, tempered as it was with the recommendation to the king's mercy. It should, however, have been recollected, that the court had no discretional power to pass any other sentence but that, or a full acquittal. But earnestly, no doubt, as the court was disposed towards the latter alternative, it could not, consistently with the rules and feelings of the service, be adopted. It is not enough in cases of mutiny, and this case was aggravated by the piratical seizure of a king's ship, that the officers and men in his Majesty's naval service should take no active part. To be neutral or passive is considered as tantamount to aiding and abetting. Besides, in the present case, the remaining in the ship along with the mutineers, without having recourse to such means as offered of leaving her, presumes a voluntary adhesion to the criminal party. The only fault of Heywood, and a pardonable one on account of his youth and inexperience, was his not asking Christian to be allowed to go with his captain, his not trying to go in time. Mackintosh, Norman, Byrne, and Coleman were acquitted because they expressed a strong desire to go, but were forced to remain. This was not only clearly proved, but they were in possession of written testimonies from Bligh to that effect. And so would Heywood have had, but for some prejudice Bligh had taken against him in the course of the boat voyage home, for it will be shown that he knew he was confined to his berth below. In favour of 3 of the 4 men condemned without a recommendation, there were unhappily no palliating circumstances. Millward, Burkitt, and Ellison were under arms from first to last, and Ellison not only left the helm to take up arms, but, rushing aft towards Bligh, called out, "D—n him, I'll be sentry over him." The fourth man, Muspratt, was condemned on the evidence of Lieutenant Hayward, which, however, appears to have been duly appreciated by the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty, and in consequence of which the poor man escaped an ignominious death. The family of young Heywood in the Isle of Man had been buoyed up, from various quarters, with the almost certainty of his full acquittal. From the 12th September, when the court-martial first sat, until the 24th of that month, they were prevented, by the strong and contrary winds which cut off all communication with England, from receiving any tidings whatever. But while Mrs. Hayward and her daughters were fondly flattering themselves with everything being most happily concluded, one evening, as they were indulging these pleasing hopes, a little boy, the son of one of their particular friends, ran into the room and told them, in the most abrupt manner, that the trial was over, and all the prisoners condemned, but that Peter Heywood was recommended to mercy. He added that a man whose name he mentioned had told him this. The man was sent for, questioned, and replied that he had seen it in a newspaper at Liverpool, from which place he had just arrived in a small fishing boat, but had forgotten to bring the paper with him. In this state of doubtful uncertainty this wretched family remained another whole week, harassed by the most cruel agony of mind, which no language can express. The affectionate Nessy determined at once to proceed to Liverpool, and so on to London. She urges her brother James at Liverpool to hasten to Portsmouth. "Don't wait for me, I can go alone. Fear and even despair will support me through the journey. Think only of our poor unfortunate and adored boy, bestow not one thought on me." And she adds, "Yet, if I could listen to reason, which is indeed difficult, it is not likely that anything serious has taken place, or will do so, as we should then certainly have had an express." She had a tempestuous passage of 49 hours, and to save 2 hours got into an open fishing boat at the mouth of the Mersey, the sea running high and washing over her every moment; but, she observes, "Let me but be pleased with the cheering influence of hope, and I have spirit to undertake anything." From Liverpool she set off the same night in the mail for London, and arrived at Mr. Graham's on the 5th October, who received her with the greatest kindness, and desired her to make his house her home. The suspense into which the afflicted family in the Isle of Man had been thrown, by the delay of the packet, was painfully relieved on its arrival in the night of the 29th September, by the following letter from Mr. Graham to the Rev. Dr. Scott, which the latter carried to Mrs. Heywood's family the following morning. Portsmouth, Tuesday, 18th September. Sir, although a stranger, I make no apology in writing to you. I have attended and given my assistance at Mr. Heywood's trial, which was finished and the sentence passed about half an hour ago. Before I tell you what that sentence is, I must inform you that his life is safe, notwithstanding it is at present at the mercy of the king, to which he is in the strongest terms recommended by the court. That any unnecessary fears may not be productive of misery to the family, I must add that the king's attorney general, who with Judge Ashurst attended the trial, desired me to make myself perfectly easy, for that my friend was as safe as if he had not been condemned. I would have avoided making use of this dreadful word, but it must have come to your knowledge, and perhaps unaccompanied by many others of a pleasing kind. To prevent its being improperly communicated to Mrs. or the Misses Heywood, whose distresses first engaged me in the business, and could not fail to call forth my best exertions upon the occasion, I send you this by express. The mode of communication I must leave to your discretion, and shall only add that, although from a combination of circumstances, ill nature, and mistaken friendship, the sentence is in itself terrible, yet it is incumbent on me to assure you that, from the same combination of circumstances, Everybody who attended the trial is perfectly satisfied in his own mind that he was hardly guilty in appearance, in intention he was perfectly innocent. I shall of course write to Commodore Pasley, whose mind, from my letter to him of yesterday, must be dreadfully agitated, and take his advice about what is to be done when Mr. Heywood is released. I shall stay here till then, and my intention is afterwards to take him to my house in town, where I think he had better stay till one of the family calls for him, for he will require a great deal of tender management after all his sufferings, and it would perhaps be a necessary preparation for seeing his mother, that one or both his sisters should be previously prepared to support her on so trying an occasion. On the following day Mr. Graham again writes to Dr. Scott, and among other things observes, "It will be a great satisfaction to his family to learn that the declarations of some of the other prisoners, since the trial, put it past all doubt that the evidence upon which he was convicted must have been, to say nothing worse of it, an unfortunate belief, on the part of the witness, of circumstances which either never had existence, or were applicable to one of the other gentlemen who remained in the ship, and not to Mr. Heywood." [Footnote 27: On the 20th September, Mr. Heywood addresses the first letter he wrote, after his conviction, to Dr. Scott. "Honored and dear Sir, on Wednesday the 12th instant the awful trial commenced, and on that day, when in court, I had the pleasure of receiving your most kind and parental letter, [Footnote 28] in answer to which I now communicate to you the melancholy issue of it, which, as I desired my friend Mr. Graham to inform you of immediately, will be no dreadful news to you. The morning lowers, and all my hope of worldly joy is fled. On Tuesday morning the 18th the dreadful sentence of death was pronounced upon me, to which, being the just decree of that divine Providence who first gave me breath, I bow my devoted head, with that fortitude, cheerfulness, and resignation, which is the duty of every member of the Church of our blessed Saviour and Redeemer, Christ Jesus. To him alone I now look up for succor, in full hope that perhaps a few days more will open to the view of my astonished and fearful soul his kingdom of eternal and incomprehensible bliss, prepared only for the righteous of heart. I have not been found guilty of the slightest act connected with that detestable crime of mutiny, but am doomed to die for not being active in my endeavors to suppress it. Could the witnesses who appeared on the court-martial be themselves tried, they would also suffer for the very same and only crime of which I have been found guilty. But I am to be the victim. Alas! my youthful inexperience, and not depravity of will, is the sole cause to which I can attribute my misfortunes. But so far from repining at my fate, I receive it with a dreadful kind of joy, composure, and serenity of mind, well assured that it has pleased God to point me out as a subject through which some greatly useful, though at present unsearchable, intention of the divine attributes may be carried into execution for the future benefit of my country. Then why should I repine at being made a sacrifice for the good, perhaps, of thousands of my fellow creatures? Forbid it, Heaven! Why should I be sorry to leave a world in which I have met with nothing but misfortunes, and all their concomitant evils? I shall, on the contrary, endeavor to divest myself of all wishes for the futile and sublunary enjoyments of it, and prepare my soul for its reception into the bosom of its Redeemer. For though the very strong recommendation I have had to his Majesty's mercy by all the members of the court may meet with his approbation, yet that is but the balance of a straw, a mere uncertainty, upon which no hope can be built. The other is a certainty that must one day happen to every mortal, and therefore the salvation of my soul requires my most prompt and powerful exertions during the short time I may have to remain on earth. As this is too tender a subject for me to inform my unhappy and distressed mother and sisters of, I trust, dear sir, you will either show them this letter, or make known to them the truly dreadful intelligence in such a manner as, assisted by your wholesome and paternal advice, may enable them to bear it with Christian fortitude. The only worldly feelings I am now possessed of are for their happiness and welfare; but even these, in my present situation, I must endeavor, with God's assistance, to eradicate from my heart, how hard soever the task. I must strive against cherishing any temporal affections. But, my dear sir, endeavor to mitigate my distressed mother's sorrow. Give my everlasting duty to her, and unabated love to my disconsolate brothers and sisters, and all my other relations. Encourage them, by my example, to bear up with fortitude and resignation to the divine will, under their load of misfortunes, almost too great for female nature to support, and teach them to be fully persuaded that all hopes of happiness on earth are vain. On my own account I still enjoy the most easy serenity of mind, and am, dear sir, for ever your greatly indebted and most dutiful, but ill-fated, Peter Heywood. His next letter is to his dearly beloved Nessy. Had I not a strong idea that, ere this mournful epistle from your ill-fated brother can reach the trembling hand of my ever dear and much afflicted Nessy, she must have been informed of the final issue of my trial, on Wednesday morning, by my honored friend Dr. Scott, I would not now add trouble to the afflicted by a confirmation of it; though I have indeed fallen an early victim to the rigid rules of the service, and though the jaws of death are once more opened upon me, yet do I not now nor ever will bow to the tyranny of base-born fear. Conscious of having done my duty to God and man, I feel not one moment's anxiety on my own account, but cherish a full and sanguine hope that perhaps a few days more will free me from the load of misfortune which has ever been my portion in this transient period of existence, and that I shall find an everlasting asylum in those blessed regions of eternal bliss, where the galling yoke of tyranny and oppression is felt no more. If earthly majesty, to whose mercy I have been recommended by the court, should refuse to put forth its lenient hand and rescue me from what is fancifully called an ignominious death, there is a heavenly King and Redeemer ready to receive the righteous penitent, on whose gracious mercy alone I, as we all should, depend, with that pious resignation which is the duty of every Christian, well convinced that, without his express permission, not even a hair of our head can fall to the ground. Oh, my sister! My heart yearns when I picture to myself the affliction, indescribable affliction, which this melancholy intelligence must have caused in the mind of my much honored mother. But let it be your peculiar endeavor to watch over her grief and mitigate her pain. I hope, indeed, this little advice from me will be unnecessary, for I know the holy precepts of that inspired religion, which, thank heaven, have been implanted in the bosoms of us all, will point out to you and all my dear relatives that fortitude and resignation which are required of us in the conflicts of human nature, and prevent you from arraigning the wisdom of that omniscient Providence, of which we ought all to have the fullest sense. I have had all my dear Nessy's letters. The one of the 17th this morning, but alas! what do they now avail? Their contents only serve to prove the instability of all human hopes and expectations. But, my dear sister, I begin to feel the pangs which you must suffer from the perusal of this melancholy paper, and will therefore desist, for I know it is more than your nature can support. The contrast between last week's correspondence and this is great indeed. But why? We had only hope then, and have we not the same now? Certainly. Endeavor then, my love, to cherish that hope, and with faith rely upon the mercy of that God who does as to him seems best and most conducive to the general good of his miserable creatures. Bear it, then, with Christian patience, and instill into the mind of my dear and now sorrowful sisters, by your advice, the same disposition, and, for heaven's sake, let not despair touch the soul of my dear mother, for then all would be over. Let James also employ all his efforts to cheer her spirits under her weight of woe. I will write no more. Adieu, my dearest love. Write but little to me, and pray for your ever affectionate but ill-fated brother. P.S. I am in perfect spirits, therefore let not your sympathizing feelings for my sufferings hurt your own precious health, which is dearer to me than life itself. Adieu." In a letter to his mother he assures her of the perfect tranquillity of his mind, advises her not to entertain too sanguine hopes, but at the same time not to be uneasy, and he adds, "A minister of the gospel, who now attends me, has advised me not to say too much to any of my dear relations, but now and then I cannot avoid it." To his dearest Nessy, who encourages him to take hope, he says, "Alas! it is but a broken stick which I have leaned on, and it has pierced my soul in such a manner that I will never more trust to it, but wait with a contented mind and patience for the final accomplishment of the divine will. Mrs. Hope is a faithless and ungrateful acquaintance, with whom I have now broken off all connections, and in her stead have endeavored to cultivate a more sure friendship with Resignation, in full trust of finding her more constant." He desires her to write through her brother James, who is with him, and says that the reason for his having desired her not to write much was, lest she might hurt herself by it; and he adds, "from an idea that your exalted sentiments upon so tender a subject ought not to be known by an inquiring world, but," he continues, "do just as you like best. I am conscious that your good sense will prompt you to nothing inconsistent with our present circumstances." To this she replies, in the true spirit of a character like her own, "Yes, my ever dearest brother, I will write to you, and I know I need not add, that in that employment, while thus deprived of your loved society, consists my only happiness. But why not express my sentiments to yourself? I have nothing to say which I should blush to have known to all the world; nothing to express on my letters to you but love and affection, and shall I blush for this? Or can I have a wish to conceal sentiments of such a nature for an object who I am so certain merits all my regard, and in whom the admiration of surrounding friends convinces me I am not mistaken? No, surely; 'tis my pride, my chiefest glory, to love you, and when you think me worthy of commendation, that praise, and that only, can make me vain. I shall not therefore write to you, my dearest brother, in a private manner, for that is unnecessary, and I abhor all deceit, in which I know you agree with me." To her sister Mary in the Isle of Man she says, "With respect to that little wretch Hallet, his intrepidity in court was astonishing, and after every evidence had spoken highly in Peter's favor, and given testimony of his innocence, so strong that not a doubt was entertained of his acquittal, he declared, unasked, that while Bligh was upon deck, he, Hallet, saw him look at and speak to Peter. What he said to him Hallet could not hear, being at the distance of 20 feet from Bligh, and Peter was 20 feet farther off, consequently a distance of 40 feet separated Mr. Bligh and my brother; but he added that Peter, on hearing what Mr. Bligh said to him, laughed and turned contemptuously away. No other witness saw Peter laugh but Hallet. On the contrary, all agreed he wore a countenance on that day remarkably sorrowful. Yet the effect of this cruel evidence was wonderful upon the minds of the court, and they concluded by pronouncing the dreadful sentence, though at the same time accompanied by the strongest recommendation to mercy. Assure yourselves, I have it from Mr. Graham's own mouth, that Peter's honour is and will be as secure as his own; that every professional man, as well as every man of sense, of whatever denomination, does and will esteem him highly; that my dear uncle Pasley, who was in town the night before my arrival, is delighted with his worth, and that, in short, we shall at length be happy." From this time a daily correspondence passed between Peter Heywood and his sister Nessy, the latter indulging hope, even to a certainty, that she will not be deceived; the other preaching up patience and resignation, with a full reliance on his innocence and integrity. "Cheer up, then," says he, "my dear Nessy, cherish your hope, and I will exercise my patience." Indeed so perfectly calm was this young man under his dreadful calamity, that in a very few days after condemnation his brother says, "While I write this, Peter is sitting by me making an Otaheitan vocabulary, and so happy and intent upon it that I have scarcely an opportunity of saying a word to him. He is in excellent spirits, and I am convinced they are better and better every day." This vocabulary is a very extraordinary performance. It consists of 100 full written folio pages, the words alphabetically arranged, and all the syllables accented. It appears, from a passage in the Voyage of the Duff, that a copy of this vocabulary was of great use to the missionaries who were first sent to Otaheite in this ship. During the delay which took place in carrying the sentence into execution, Commodore Pasley, Mr. Graham, and others were indefatigable in their inquiries and exertions to ascertain what progress had been made in bringing to a happy issue the recommendation to the Fountain of Mercy. Not less so was Nessy Heywood. From Mr. Graham she learnt what this excellent man considered to be the principal parts of the evidence that led to the conviction of her unhappy brother, which, having understood that to be the following, she transmitted to her brother. First, that he assisted in hoisting out the launch. Second, that he was seen by the carpenter resting his hand upon a cutlass. Third, that on being called to by Lieutenant Bligh he laughed. Fourth, that he remained in the Bounty instead of accompanying Bligh in the launch. On these points of the evidence Mr. Heywood made the following comments, which he sent from Portsmouth to his sister in town. Peter Heywood's remarks upon material points in the evidence which was given at his trial on board the Duke in the Portsmouth harbour. First, that I assisted in hoisting out the launch. This boat was asked for by the captain and his officers, and whoever assisted in hoisting her out were their friends, for if the captain had been sent away in the cutter, which was Christian's first intention, he could not have taken with him more than 9 or 10 men, whereas the launch carried 19. The boatswain, the master, the gunner, and the carpenter say, in their evidence, that they considered me as helping the captain on this occasion. Second, that I was seen by the carpenter resting my hand on a cutlass. I was seen in this position by no other person than the carpenter. No other person, therefore, could be intimidated by my appearance. Was the carpenter intimidated by it? No. So far from being afraid of me, he did not even look upon me in the light of a person armed, but pointed out to me the danger there was of my being thought so, and I immediately took away my hand from the cutlass, upon which I had very innocently put it when I was in a state of stupor. The court was particularly pointed in its inquiries into this circumstance, and the carpenter was pressed to declare, on the oath he had taken, and after maturely considering the matter, whether he did, at the time he saw me so situated, or had since been inclined to believe, that, under all the circumstance of the case, I could be considered as an armed man, to which he unequivocally answered, No. And he gave some good reasons, which will be found in his evidence, for thinking that I had not a wish to be armed during the mutiny. The master, the boatswain, the gunner, Mr. Hayward, Mr. Hallett, and John Smith, who, with the carpenter, were all the witnesses belonging to the Bounty, say, in their evidence, that they did not, any of them, see me armed. And the boatswain and the carpenter further say, in the most pointed terms, that they considered me to be one of the captain's party, and by no means as belonging to the mutineers. And the master, the boatswain, the carpenter, the gunner, all declare that, from what they observed on my conduct during the mutiny, and from a recollection of my behaviour previous thereto, they were convinced I would have afforded them all the assistance in my power, if an opportunity had afforded to retake the ship. Third, that upon being called to by the captain, I laughed. If this was believed by the court, it must have had, I am afraid, a very great effect upon its judgment; for if viewed in too serious a light, it would seem to bring together and combine a number of trifling circumstances, which by themselves could only be treated merely as matters of suspicion. It was no doubt, therefore, received with caution, and considered with the utmost candour. The countenance, I grant, on some other occasions, may warrant an opinion of good or evil existing in the mind, but on the momentous events of life and death it is surely by much too indefinite and hazardous even to listen to for a moment. The different ways of expressing our various passions are, with many, as variable as the features they wear. Tears have often been, nay generally are, the relief of excessive joy, while misery and dejection have, many a time, disguised themselves in a smile, and convulsive laughs have betrayed the anguish of an almost broken heart. To judge, therefore, the principles of the heart by the barometer of the face is as erroneous as it would be absurd and unjust. This matter may likewise be considered in another point of view. Mr. Hallet says I laughed in consequence of being called to by the captain, who was abaft the mizzen mast, while I was upon the platform near the fore hatchway, a distance of more than 30 feet. If the captain intended I should hear him, and there can be no doubt that he wished it, if he really called to me, he must have exerted his voice, and very considerably too, upon such an occasion, and in such a situation; and yet Mr. Hallet himself, who, by being on the quarter-deck, could not have been half the distance from the captain that I was, even he, I say, could not hear what was said to me. How then, in the name of God, was it possible that I should have heard the captain at all, situated as I must have been, in the midst of noisy confusion? And if I did not hear him, which I most solemnly aver to be the truth, even granting that I laughed, which, however, in my present awful situation, I declare I believe I did not, it could not have been at what the captain said. Upon this ground, then, I hope I shall stand acquitted of this charge, for if the crime derives its guilt from the knowledge I had of the captain's speaking to me, it follows, of course, that if I did not hear him speak, there could be no crime in my laughing. It may, however, very fairly be asked, why Mr. Hallet did not make known that the captain was calling to me? His duty to the captain, if not his friendship for me, should have prompted him to it; and the peculiarity of our situation required this act of kindness at his hands. [Footnote 29. I shall only observe further from this head, that the boatswain, the carpenter, and Mr. Hayward, who saw more of me than any other of the witnesses, did say in their evidence that I had rather a sorrowful countenance on the day of the mutiny. Fourth, that I remained on board the ship instead of going in the boat with the captain. That I was at first alarmed and afraid of going into the boat I will not pretend to deny; but that afterwards I wished to accompany the captain, and should have done it if I had not been prevented by Thompson, who confined me below by the order of Churchill, is clearly proved by the evidence of several of the witnesses. The boatswain says that just before he left the ship I went below, and in passing him said something about a bag. It was, that I would put a few things into a bag and follow him. The carpenter says he saw me go below at this time, and both those witnesses say that they heard the master-at-arms call to Thompson to keep them below. The point, therefore, will be to prove to whom this order, keep them below, would apply. The boatswain and carpenter say they have no doubt of its meaning me as one, and that it must have been so I shall have very little difficulty in showing by the following statement. There remained on board the ship after the boat put off 25 men. Messrs. Hayward and Hallet have proved that the following were under arms: Christian, Hillbrant, Millward, Burkett, Muspratt, Ellison, Sumner, Smith, Young, Skinner, Churchill, McCoy, Quintal, Morrison, Williams, Thompson, Mills, and Brown, in all 18. The master, and upon this occasion I may be allowed to quote from the captain's printed narrative, mentions Martin as one, which makes the number of armed men 19, none of whom, we may reasonably suppose, were ordered to be kept below. Indeed, Mr. Hayward says, that there were at the least 18 of them upon deck, when he went into the boat, and if Thompson, the sentinel over the arm-chest, be added to them, it exactly agrees with the number above named. There remains then 6 to whom Churchill's order, keep them below, might apply, namely, Heywood, Stewart, Coleman, Norman, M'Intosh, and Byrne. Could Byrne have been one of them? No, for he was in the cutter alongside. Could Coleman have been one of them? No, for he was at the gangway when the captain and officers went into the launch, and aft upon the taffrail when the boat was veered astern. Could Norman have been one of them? No, for he was speaking to the officers. Could Mackintosh have been one of them? No, for he was with Coleman and Norman, desiring the captain and officers to take notice that they were not concerned in the mutiny. It could then have applied to nobody but Mr. Stewart and myself, and by this order of Churchill, therefore, was I prevented from going with the captain in the boat. The foregoing appear to me the most material points of evidence on the part of the prosecution. My defense being very full, and the body of evidence in my favor too great to admit of observation in this concise manner, I shall refer for an opinion thereon to the minutes of the court-martial. Signed, P. Heywood. End of Chapter 7, Part 1.
Chapter 7, Part 2 of the Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brett Downey and Teresa Downey. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 7, Part 2. There is a note in Marshall's Naval Biography, footnote 30, furnished by Captain Heywood, which shows one motive for keeping him and Stewart in the ship. It is as follows. Mr. Stewart was no sooner released than he demanded of Christian the reason of his detention, upon which the latter denied having given any directions to that effect, and his assertion was corroborated by Churchill, who declared that he kept both him and Mr. Heywood below, knowing it was their intention to go away with Bligh. In which case, added he, what would become of us, if anything should happen to you? Who is there but yourself and them to depend upon in navigating the ship? It may be suspected, however, that neither Christian nor Churchill told the exact truth, and that Mr. Heywood's case is, in point of fact, much stronger than he ever could have imagined, and that if Bligh had not acted the part of a prejudiced and unfair man towards him, he would have been acquitted by the court on the same ground that Coleman, Norman, Mackintosh, and Byrne were, namely, that they were detained in the ship against their will, as stated by Bligh in the narrative on which they were tried, and also in his printed report. It has before been observed that many things are set down in Bligh's original manuscript journal that have not appeared in any published document, and on this part of the subject there is, in the former, the following very important admission. As for the officers whose cabins were in the cockpit, there was no relief for them. They endeavoured to come to my assistance, but were not allowed to put their heads above the hatchway. To say, therefore, that in the suppression of this passage Bligh acted with prejudice and unfairness, is to make use of mild terms. It has more the appearance of a deliberate act of malice, by which two innocent men might have been condemned to suffer an ignominious death, one of whom was actually brought into this predicament. The other only escaped it by a premature death. It may be asked, how did Bligh know that Stewart and Heywood endeavoured, but were not allowed, to come to his assistance? Confined as he was on the quarter deck, how could he know what was going on below? The answer is, he must have known it from Christian himself. Churchill, no doubt, acted entirely by his leader's orders, and the latter could give no orders that were not heard by Bligh, whom he never left, but held the cord by which his hands were fettered, till he was forced into the boat. Churchill was quite right as to the motive of keeping these young officers, but Christian had no doubt another and a stronger motive. He knew how necessary it was to interpose a sort of barrier between himself and his mutinous gang. He was too good an adept not to know that seamen will always pay a more ready and cheerful obedience to officers who are gentlemen, than to those who may have risen to the command from among themselves. It is indeed a common observation in the service, that officers who have risen from before the mast are generally the greatest tyrants. Footnote 31. It was Bligh's misfortune not to have been educated in the cockpit of a man of war, among young gentlemen, which is to the navy what a public school is to those who are to move in civil society. What painful sufferings to the individual, and how much misery to an affectionate family might have been spared, had Bligh, instead of suppressing, only suffered the passage to stand as originally written in his journal. The remarks of young Heywood, above recited, were received and transmitted by his sister Nessy in a letter to the Earl of Chatham, then First Lord of the Admiralty, of which the following is a copy.
Great Russell Street, 11th October, 1792. My Lord, to a nobleman of your lordship's known humanity and excellence of heart, I dare hope that the unfortunate cannot plead in vain. Deeply impressed as I therefore am with sentiments of the most profound respect for a character which I have been ever taught to revere, and alas, I nearly interested as I must be in the subject of these lines, may I request your lordship will generously pardon a sorrowful and mourning sister for presuming to offer the enclosed remarks for your candid perusal. It contains a few observations made by my most unfortunate and tenderly beloved brother Peter Heywood, endeavouring to elucidate some parts of the evidence given at the court-martial lately held at Portsmouth upon himself and other prisoners of his Majesty's ship Bounty. When I assure you, my lord, that he is dearer and more precious to me than any object on earth, nay, infinitely more valuable than life itself, that, deprived of him, the word misery would but ill express my complicated wretchedness, and that on his fate, my own, and shall I not add, that of a tender, fond, and alas, widowed mother depends, I am persuaded you will not wonder, nor be offended, that I am thus bold in conjuring your lordship will consider, with your usual candour and benevolence, the observations I now offer you, as well as the painful situation of my dear and unhappy brother. I have the honour, etc., Nessy Heywood.
Whether this letter and its enclosure produced any effect on the mind of Lord Chatham does not appear, but no immediate steps were taken, nor was any answer given, and this amiable young lady and her friends were suffered to remain in the most painful state of suspense for another fortnight. A day or two before the warrant was dispatched, that excellent man, Mr. Graham, writes thus to Mrs. Heywood: My dear Madam, if feeling for the distresses and rejoicing in the happiness of others denote a heart which entitles the owner of it to the confidence of the good and virtuous, I would fain be persuaded that mine has been so far interested in your misfortunes, and is now so pleased with the prospect of your being made happy, as cannot fail to procure me the friendship of your family, which, as it is my ambition, it cannot cease to be my desire to cultivate. Unused to the common rewards which are sought after in this world, I will profess to anticipate more real pleasure and satisfaction from the simple declaration of you and yours, that we accept of your services and we thank you for them, than it is in common minds to conceive. But, fearful lest too grateful sense should be entertained of the friendly offices I have been engaged in, which, however, I ought to confess I was prompted to, in the first place, by remembrance of the many obligations I owed to Commodore Pasley, I must beg you will recollect that, by sending to me your charming Nessy, and if strong affection may plead such a privilege, I may be allowed to call her my daughter also. You would have overpaid me if my trouble had been 10 times, and my uneasiness 10,000 times greater than they were, upon what I once thought the melancholy, but now deem the fortunate, occasion which has given me the happiness of her acquaintance. Thus far, my dear madam, I have written to you to please myself, now for what must please you, and in which, too, I have my share of satisfaction. The business, though not publicly known, is most certainly finished, and what I had my doubts about yesterday I am satisfied of today. Happy, happy, happy family! Accept of my congratulations, not for what it is in the power of words to express, but for what I know you will feel, upon being told that your beloved Peter will soon be restored to your bosom, with every virtue that can adorn a man, and ensure to him an affectionate, a tender, and truly welcome reception. At the foot of this letter Nessie writes thus:
Now, my dearest mamma, did you ever in all your life read so charming a letter? Be assured it is exactly characteristic of the benevolent writer. What would I give to be transported, though only for a moment, to your elbow, that I might see you read it? What will you feel when you know assuredly that you may with certainty believe its contents? Well, may Mr. Graham call us happy, for never felicity could equal ours. Don't expect connected sentences from me at present, for this joy makes me almost delirious. Adieu. Love to all. I need not say be happy and blessed as I am at this dear hour, my beloved mother. Your most affectionate N.H.
On the 24th October the King's warrant was dispatched from the Admiralty, granting a full and free pardon to Heywood and Morrison, a respite for Muspratt, which was followed by a pardon, and for carrying the sentence of Ellison, Burkitt, and Millward into execution, which was done on the 29th on board His Majesty's ship Brunswick in Portsmouth harbour. On this melancholy occasion Captain Hammond reports that the criminals behaved with great penitence and decorum, acknowledged the justice of their sentence for the crime of which they had been found guilty, and exhorted their fellow sailors to take warning by their untimely fate, and whatever might be their hardships never to forget their obedience to their officers as a duty they owed to their king and country. The captain adds, a party from each ship in the harbour and at Spithead attended the execution, and from the reports I have received the example seems to have made a great impression upon the minds of all the ship's companies present. The same warrant that carried with it affliction to the friends of these unfortunate men was the harbinger of joy to the family and friends of young Heywood. The happy intelligence was communicated to his affectionate Nessie on the 26th, who instantly dispatched the joyful tidings to her anxious mother in the following characteristic note:
Friday, 26th October, 4 o'clock. Oh, blessed hour! Little did I think, my beloved friends, when I closed my letter this morning, that before night I should be out of my senses with joy. This moment, this ecstatic moment, brought the enclosed.
Footnote 32.
I cannot speak my happiness. Let it be sufficient to say that in a very few hours our angel Peter will be free. Mr. Graham goes this night to Portsmouth, and tomorrow, or next day at furthest, I shall be, oh heavens, what shall I be? I am already transported, even to pain. Then how shall I bear to clasp him to the bosom of your happy, ah, how very happy and affectionate Nessie Heywood. I am too mad to write sense, but 'tis a pleasure I would not forego to be the most reasonable being on earth. I asked Mr. Graham, who is at my elbow, if he would say anything to you. Lord, said he, I can't say anything. He is almost as mad as myself.
Footnote 33. Mr. Graham writes, I have, however, my senses sufficiently about me not to suffer this to go without begging leave to congratulate you upon, and to assure you that I most sincerely sympathize and participate in the happiness which I am sure the enclosed will convey to the mother and sisters of my charming and beloved Nessie. This charming girl next writes to Mr. Const, who attended as counsel for her brother, to acquaint him with the joyful intelligence, and thus concludes:
I flatter myself you will partake in the joy which, notwithstanding it is so excessive at this moment, as almost to deprive me of my faculties, leaves me however sufficiently collected to assure you of the eternal gratitude and esteem with which I am, etc.
To which Mr. Const, after congratulations and thanks for her polite attention, observes, Give me leave, my dear Miss Heywood, to assure you that the intelligence has given me a degree of pleasure which I have not terms to express, and it is even increased by knowing what you must experience on the event. Nor is it an immaterial reflection, that although your brother was unfortunately involved in the general calamity which gave birth to the charge, he is uncontaminated by the crime, for there was not a credible testimony of the slightest fact against him that can make the strictest friend deplore anything that has passed, except his sufferings, and his uniform conduct under them only proved how little he deserved them. Mr. Graham's impatience and generous anxiety to give the finishing stroke to this joyful event would not permit him to delay one moment in setting out for Portsmouth, and bringing up to his house in town the innocent sufferer, where they arrived on the morning of the 29th October. Miss Heywood can best speak of her own feelings.
Great Russell Street, Monday morning, 29th October, 10:30 o'clock, the brightest moment of my existence. My dearest mamma, I have seen him, clasped him to my bosom, and my felicity is beyond expression. In person he is almost even now as I could wish. In mind you know him as an angel. I can write no more, but to tell you that the three happiest beings at this moment on earth are your most dutiful and affectionate children, Nessie Heywood, Peter Heywood, James Heywood. Love to and from all, 10,000 times.
The worthy Mr. Graham adds, "If, my dearest madam, it were ever given for mortals to be supremely blessed on earth, mine to be sure must be the happy family. Heavens! with what unbounded extravagance have we been forming our wishes, and yet how far beyond our most abounded wishes were we blessed. Nessie, Maria, Footnote 34. Peter and James, I see, have all been endeavouring to express their feelings. I will not fail in any such attempt, for I will not attempt anything beyond an assurance that the scene I have been witness of, and in which I am happily so great a sharer, beggars all description. Permit me, however, to offer my most sincere congratulations upon the joyful occasion." This amiable young lady, some of whose letters have been introduced into this narrative, did not long survive her brother's liberty. This impassioned and most affectionate of sisters, with an excess of sensibility, which acted too powerfully on her bodily frame, sunk, as is often the case with such susceptible minds, on the first attack of consumption. She died within the year of her brother's liberation. On this occasion the following note from her afflicted mother appears among the papers from which the letters and poetry are taken.
My dearest Nessie was seized, while on a visit at Major York's at Bishop's Grove, near Tunbridge Wells, with a violent cold, and not taking proper care of herself, it soon turned to inflammation on her lungs, which carried her off at Hastings, to which place she was taken on the 5th September, to try if the change of air and being near the sea would recover her. But alas! it was too late for her to receive the wished for benefit, and she died there on the 25th of the same month, 1793, and has left her only surviving parent, a disconsolate mother, to lament, while ever she lives, with the most sincere and deep affliction, the irreparable loss of her most valuable, affectionate, and darling daughter.
Footnote 35. But to return to Mr. Heywood. When the king's full and free pardon had been read to this young officer by Captain Montague, with a suitable admonition and congratulation, he addressed that officer in the following terms, so suitably characteristic of his noble and manly conduct throughout the whole of the distressing business in which he was innocently involved: "Sir, when the sentence of the law was passed upon me, I received it, I trust, as became a man, and if it had been carried into execution I should have met my fate, I hope, in a manner becoming a Christian. Your admonition cannot fail to make a lasting impression on my mind. I receive with gratitude my sovereign's mercy, for which my future life shall be faithfully devoted to his service." Footnote 36. And well did his future conduct fulfil that promise, notwithstanding the inauspicious manner in which the first 5 years of his servitude in the navy had been passed, 2 of which were spent among mutineers and savages, and 18 months as a close prisoner in irons, in which condition he was shipwrecked, and within an ace of perishing. Notwithstanding this unpromising commencement, he re-entered the naval service under the auspices of his uncle Commodore Pasley and Lord Hood, who presided at his trial, and who earnestly recommended him to embark again as a midshipman without delay, offering to take him into the Victory, under his own immediate patronage. In the course of his service, to qualify for the commission of lieutenant, he was under the respective commands of 3 or 4 distinguished officers, who had sat on his trial, from all whom he received the most flattering proofs of esteem and approbation. To the application of Sir Thomas Pasley to Lord Spencer for his promotion, that nobleman, with that due regard he was always known to pay to the honour and interest of the navy, while individual claims were never overlooked, he gave the following reply, which must have been highly gratifying to the feelings of Mr. Heywood and his family. Admiralty, January 13th, 1797. Sir, I should have returned an earlier answer to your letter of the 6th instant, if I had not been desirous, before I answered it, to look over, with as much attention as was in my power, the proceedings on the court-martial held in the year 1792, by which court Mr. Peter Heywood was condemned for being concerned in the mutiny on board the Bounty. I felt this to be necessary, from having entertained a very strong opinion that it might be detrimental to the interests of His Majesty's service, if a person under such a predicament should be afterwards advanced to the higher and more conspicuous situations of the navy. But having, with great attention, perused the minutes of that court-martial, as far as they relate to Mr. Peter Heywood, I have now the satisfaction of being able to inform you, that I think his case was such an one, as, under all its circumstances, though I do not mean to say that the court were not justified in their sentence, ought not to be considered as a bar to his further progress in his profession, more especially when the gallantry and propriety of his conduct, in his subsequent service, are taken into consideration. I shall, therefore, have no difficulty in mentioning him to the Commander-in-Chief on the station to which he belongs, as a person from whose promotion, on a proper opportunity, I shall derive much satisfaction, more particularly from his being so nearly connected with you. I have the honour to be, etc., (Signed) Spencer. It is not here intended to follow Mr. Heywood through his honourable career of service, during the long and arduous contest with France, and in the several commands with which he was entrusted. In a note of his own writing it is stated, that on paying off the Montague, in July 1816, he came on shore, after having been actively employed at sea 27 years, 6 months, 1 week, and 5 days, out of a servitude in the navy of 29 years, 7 months, and 1 day. Having reached nearly the top of the list of captains, he died in this present year, leaving behind him a high and unblemished character in that service, of which he was a most honourable, intelligent, and distinguished member. Chapter 7 Part 2 Recording by Brett Downey and Teresa Downey